that many of the Hezbollah security people around here are using for this afternoon's funerals had exploded. We then saw a number of people, the Hezbollah security, gathering up all the walkie-talkies and taking the batteries out of them. Our cameraman, Sky cameraman, Jake Britton, who was trying to film all of this, was surrounded by very angry, tense Hezbollah security people who told him to stop filming. They were very angry. The situation here is obviously very tense. The funeral is still going ahead. As this was going on, as the news was unfolding in front of us, we started to get reports from around the country, further south in Lebanon, of replica small explosions. We don't know yet how many people are injured or how badly. We know here that two ambulances have turned out. One raced down the road that you see me standing on and appeared to pick up someone. Another one is waiting at the top. For the first time, because we've come to a number of these funerals over the past few months, there's an army presence here. And the coffins are just coming down here. There's an army presence here with a couple of personnel carriers stationed along the route. And we're hearing, a lot of people are extremely tense and very, very angry about what's happening here.
Yes, and Alex, look, as we're talking and looking at these pictures of that scene, we can see people gathered there for that funeral. Just an update on those walkie-talkies that we think this time have exploded. It is reported security sources being quoted as saying that these walkie-talkies were purchased at around about the same time as those pagers were purchased. And I guess that would be fitting with what had been reported this morning and yesterday, saying that, Hezbollah had been told to stop using mobile phones and had been told to start using more analog, if we can describe them as such, devices to stop their GPS signals being tracked. But I guess if the reporting is right, that would not have stopped them being targeted in this way.
No, I mean, the problem of the Hezbollah communications network being infiltrated or being compromised was identified by the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, many, many months ago, way back at the start of the year. He gave several speeches in which he urged his supporters and anyone else to stop using phones near any sensitive areas. Even when we come to, obviously everyone's got a lot of mobile phones, but we were often told not to bring our phones into where the coffins were, where the senior Hezbollah politicians were. They were very, very sensitive. They're very sensitive all round. There's an incredible tension, very understandably in many ways, because of the large number of casualties from yesterday's pager explosion. We were hearing from the Minister of Health, who spoke to Sky News, saying that there were now 300 of those injured who are now on the critical list. That there were for the North. Have suffered life-changing injuries. Many have lost their sight, many have lost limbs. It's still so tense and so ongoing that a lot of them haven't been able to even keep account of who is being injured and what injuries they're suffering from. But at least two doctors and the Hezbollah officials and the Minister of Health confirmed that many of the injuries involve women and children, although the bulk of them are young men.
OK, Alex, thank you for that. Look, as we can see, Alex Crawford is at this funeral being held for 4 people there, and as you can imagine, it is a very emotionally fraught event that Alex is covering for us. We're going to stick with this, of course, because I want to just bring you another line that's come in from Hezbollah official Hashem Safiuddin, who says that the group is facing a new phase. Punishment is certainly coming. The retaliation has been threatened. Now it seems as if the retaliation toward Israel, who, of course, we must say, just a caveat, have not admitted to having done this, but all fingers point towards Israel as being responsible for this attack. it would seem as if there is some kind of retribution due. We are expecting as well, Alex, as you're in country, to hear from the leader of Hezbollah tomorrow, I believe, Hassan Nasrallah. Look, in terms of response, what do we expect that to look like? You're able to speak to Hezbollah officials today and get a sense from them at their anger. We've seen that rockets have been fired in the last hour or so across the border, southern border into the north of Israel. What do they sense as being their response, Alex?
They are furious, absolutely furious. Obviously, there's a sense of vulnerability. There's a lot of anger, not just from Hezbollah supporters, but from ordinary Lebanese civilians, because a lot of these pages that went off in very public areas. I mean, let me show you the picture of the little boy whose funeral it is right now. That's his picture. He's 10 years old, and he's the son of this man's cousin. He's telling me. So tell me, you're on live on Sky News. Tell me, how do you feel about the explosion?
He gave the telephone over the patient of your father. He's on television. He comes from school. After when he have the run, he take it down. He explodes directly in his face.
Yeah.
How 11 years?
Yeah, help the Lebanese. Yeah. So you heard that his father had the pager, but the little boy picked it up when the message went off, and he suffered the consequences. Obviously, a lot of these pages, as you will know, yesterday went off in very public areas, supermarkets, open air markets, homes, people on their bikes. According to the Minister of Health here in Lebanon, he felt the attacks were indiscriminate. They were, in his words, an act of aggression delivered by people who did not want to partake in peace. And he called it a slap in the face for those like the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, like Amos Hochstein, who's the US Special Envoy, who's trying to broker a peace deal and trying to get all sides to agree to a ceasefire so that this stops, because Hezbollah entered the fray, the war, on October the 8th, the day after Hamas mounted its attack inside Israel, and had very much linked a ceasefire to them stopping any attacks. Since October the 8th, there's been an ongoing, ever-increasing escalation of tit-for-tat between Lebanon and Israel, with hundreds of thousands of people having to be evacuated from not just northern Israel, but also southern Lebanon. This has taken the whole act between the two up to a very new level, with many ordinary people being affected. And that is, according to the Minister of the Health, has not led to a despondency or a hopelessness from the people in Lebanon, but a galvanizing, a sort of coming together, a joint community anger about what is happening. And one of the doctors, one of the eye surgeons who's trying to carry out much of the surgery, because a lot of the injuries are facial and eye injuries and amputations of hands and fingers. He called it a massacre and said it was a crime. Whoever carried this out was a crime, and you're not going to find many people here who don't want to blame Israel for that. And he also said, I thought perhaps because I'm a Western reporter, that the complicity of the West, no thank you, nice man offering me coffee. The complicity of the West, the silence, as he described it, from political leaders around the world was as much of a crime as well, in his view.
OK, look, Alex Crawford reporting there from the scene of a funeral of 4 of those who were killed. Alex showing us that picture of that young boy, the 10-year-old who was killed. And Alex, just while we recap sort of exactly where we are with this, I want to bring you some more lines that have come in. When we speak about the sort of indiscriminate nature of this, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has appealed for calm and called for an independent investigation into the circumstance of these explosions, also adding that attacks like these violate international human rights law and potentially also international humanitarian law. That comes after the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, also said that everything must now be done to avoid any escalation following these explosions. And, Alex, you're reporting from Beirut, from these funerals, and before we came to you, we had that reporting that there were more explosions heard. It said that the explosions this time may well have been handheld radios. It was around about this time yesterday when we first started reporting on the explosions of those pages. Talk to us about the sense within Hezbollah of feeling as if, even though they made the very conscious decision to switch away from using mobile phone technology, that even the technology that they have now taken on has in many ways been compromised, and what that does to them as a force.
Listen, I can't, just talking to ordinary people here, when the explosion, the very small explosion went off at this funeral just a short while ago, I saw women crying, running with their children. Anyone who's in this area is obviously, whether they're a Hezbollah, a family person who happens to live in this area, it is a Hezbollah stronghold, but it's a very populated residential area as well, with Arabs, but there are also Christians. So there's a huge big church just down the road, as well as mosques. And anyone who's in this vicinity, which was also one of the key areas targeted yesterday by the pages, is going to feel very, very vulnerable. I would suggest that's human nature. So this happening, the fact that they managed to penetrate, probably the biggest and most powerful non-state actor.
All right, let's just step away from Alex for a moment in Beirut. As you can see, she is on the ground reporting currently, and this is the scene in the Lebanese capital. Funerals being held for 4 of those killed in the explosions of those pages across Lebanon yesterday, including the funeral being held here for a 10-year-old boy. And just as the funerals were getting underway, reports started to come through that more explosions had been heard. Security sources suggesting that the explosion devices this time were handheld radios. Hezbollah had made the decision a number of months ago to switch away from using mobile phones so that their GPS signals couldn't be tracked and that their members could not be targeted. They switched to more basic devices, pages and handheld radios, but judging by the incidents of the past 24 hours, those devices are no longer safe. The head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has said that everything must be done to avoid any escalation, also saying that civilian items must not be used as weapons. It is reported that after this latest round of explosions in the past half an hour or so, a number of people have been injured as a result of the explosion. Dozens of people wounded as a result of the exploding handheld radios, as well as there is more news emerging as we speak. 3 people killed in the latest explosions in the Bekaa region of Lebanon. That's according to the state news agency being reported by the Reuters news wire. Those funerals ongoing. Hezbollah have vowed there will be retaliation. 12 people known to have been killed so far. That is not counting the 3 that have just been announced to have been killed in the Bekaa region following the latest explosions of handheld devices. This thought to be handheld radios that have exploded today in parts of Lebanon. The UN calling for calm. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights saying that attacks such as these violate international human rights law and potentially also international humanitarian law. Let's bring in our Security and Defence Senator, Deborah Haynes, who is also following this for us. Deb, look, it's great to have you with us. We were speaking yesterday when the pages were going off and exploding around Lebanon, and now it would seem today as if handheld radios are doing the same.
Yes, it must just be it's amplifying what was already a very chaotic scene yesterday, and instilling a huge sense of chaos and fear, you'd imagine, not just at the heart of the Hezbollah militants whose handheld device, whose pages were exploding yesterday, but as Alex was saying, to civilians as well. These people, when the explosions happened yesterday, they were going about their sort of daily routines, and the explosions seemed to be pretty indiscriminate in terms of where they happened and the scale of the people that were affected and the scale of the injuries. So already reeling from an unprecedented attack as happened yesterday, to have again more explosions, and you've got reports saying that these are handheld radios that are now detonating. You can only imagine that is just amplifying the sense of confusion, which presumably is the desired effect of those behind these attacks. And Lebanon and Hezbollah have come out very strongly saying that this is believed to be Israel. Israel hasn't said anything themselves, but all of the security experts that I've spoken to and others have spoken to believe that obviously the most likely suspect behind this has to be Israel, given the nature of the politics of the region and also the knowledge of Israel's technological know-how. There was a lot of analysis going on ever since the attacks on the pages yesterday as to how that could happen. And it does seem as though the supply chain for those pages was tampered with explosive devices put inside the pages, and then a trigger, a message sent to all of them at the same time, which prompted those mass explosions. With handheld radios, I was just been speaking to an expert just now to try and ask about how, could the same thing be done there? And it does seem as though, again, obviously we're waiting to have confirmation as to exactly what has happened. But again, it is obviously conceivable that these handheld radios, if it had been possible to infiltrate the supply chain of them, that they too could have been turned into ticking time bombs, effectively, and then detonated. And it does sound like something from a science fiction movie, but it really does underline how, as people were saying to me yesterday, when it comes to this kind of unconventional warfare and war in general, then the only limitations are the imagination of the attacker and the technology that's available to them. And we really are seeing that play out. And again, the sort of speculation yesterday was why has this attack happened now? What else is expected to come next? Is this some kind of strike because there was concerns that Hezbollah had actually detected the potential for their pages to have been tampered with, and so the feeling was use it or lose it? Or is this actually part of a bigger strategy of using the pager attacks to sow confusion and then follow up with further strikes? And if it remains to be seen exactly how big a scale attack it is today in terms of these new explosions. But obviously it does seem to be linked, and the question will be what next.
Yeah, and on those today explosions, Deborah, as well, it is reported that 3 people have been killed as a result of those handheld radios blowing up in Beirut. And you mentioned the idea, I think, that this kind of disruptive attack by Israel would be the precursor to any wider scale attack across the Israeli northern border into Lebanon. It's worth bearing in mind, isn't it, Deb, that just a couple of nights ago, it was reported that defeating Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon and making sure that Israelis living in the north of Israel could return home was now a key war aim that decided by the Israeli cabinet. It's not clear at this point whether or not this is the beginning of that process, but it would seem to be taking us in that direction as, we continue to await what is being now a promised response from Hezbollah.
Yes, and also you can imagine that maybe Israel has looked at what has actually been a restrained response by both Hezbollah and Iran to those assassinations that happened over the summer, where you had the killing of a very senior Hezbollah commander in Beirut, the killing of a very senior Hamas leader in Tehran. And there was a real concern then amongst Western allies that could be the trigger for a full-scale war between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel, which is something that leaders in the region and globally have been trying to contain ever since the October the 7th attacks by Hamas into Israel. And then you had that massive surge of diplomacy with the Foreign Secretary here, the American Secretary of State, leaders in the region shuttling around trying to contain that flashpoint. And seemingly in the last few weeks there's been a bit of a sort of collective, not sigh of relief, but a feeling that crisis had been contained. And so then for this to then happen, one analyst I was speaking to was saying that it could be that Israel looked at the sort of restrained lack of a massive fight back by Hezbollah and Iran to those attacks and decided that maybe they could go further. And then you're seeing the events playing out. Obviously, it's all just speculation. We don't know exactly what the strategy is behind this, but the more that these kinds of attacks escalate and the greater the harm that is inflicted, the much harder it becomes to prevent a full-scale escalation into all-out war, which is clearly what people are going to be thinking could be the next step. And it's something that that we hear repeatedly that neither side actually wants, especially when it comes to Iran and Israel. Obviously, for Israel, as you said, they've openly stated that they want to return their people to the north of Israel, from where they've had to actually retreat because of Hezbollah rocket attacks that have been intensifying ever since the October the 7th attacks. And so, yes, like you say, maybe this is an opportunistic moment where the Israelis feel they have the capacity to be able to strike back. But again, this is very unconventional, the kind of method that's being used at the moment. Israel isn't openly coming out and saying anything in terms of what it may or may not have done in terms of involvement in yesterday's blasts and today's attacks. And obviously, people in the region have a very clear idea as to what is going on, but exactly why and what's happening next, it's still really a guessing game.
It is indeed, Deb, and it's going to be a question as to how long that sort of lack of information about exactly how this happened can sustain if there is a retaliation of sorts from Hezbollah. Look, Deb, thanks very much for that. Back to you in a moment as we continue to look at these pictures of the Lebanese capital Beirut as those funerals of those 4 people are ongoing, as well as the Israel-Lebanon border, where, as Deb was saying, hundreds of thousands of people have had to be evacuated because of near daily exchanges of rocket and missile fire across that border following the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October. Well, the head of the UN, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been speaking about this in the last few minutes, saying that everything must be done to avoid escalation. Let's listen to what Guterres has had to say.
The logic of making all these devices explode is to do it as a preemptive strike before a major military operation. So, as important as the event in itself is the indication that this event confirms that there is a serious risk of a dramatic escalation in Lebanon, and everything must be done to avoid that escalation.
Well, Antonio Guterres speaking earlier, suggesting this, what we're seeing here, could be the precursor to something broader from the Israelis. Let's speak now to Miri Aysen. Joining us by phone, she is a retired colonel in the Israel Defense Force. Miri Aysen, thanks so much for making the time to speak to us today at a time of really heightened tension in the region. What did you make, first of all, of what was suggested there by Antonio Guterres, that what we're seeing here today and yesterday is the precursor to something bigger between Israel and Hezbollah?
I would have appreciated it more if the Secretary General had mentioned that Hezbollah is an enormous terror military force in Lebanon, that it is not the Lebanon country. This is a terror military force with tens of thousands of fighters in what is essentially a private militia. And I would ask Secretary General of the United Nations, what would you have us do? Nothing? I don't know if Israel did this, but I do know that when you allow a terror army to grow and you don't do anything against it, you get an October 7th attack. And I cannot think as an Israeli that we would in any way look at Hezbollah, which is 10 times Hamas's force, and just let them do an October 7th attack, and they have been attacking since October 7th themselves.
Miri Eisen, as you say, Israel have not claimed responsibility for this. What did you make of the strategy, if it was to be Israel, to disrupt the pagers, the handheld devices, the basic handheld devices of Hezbollah in this way? Some have described what has happened as indiscriminate.
And I'm asking again, both you and Secretary General of the United Nations, so what do you do against a terror entity? Nothing? So we're talking here about the most personal device. Every single person I know has their cell phone in their pocket. It is something which is on the person using it. So is there no way to do anything?
No, but Miri, I take that
to
point.
Me, that it's not indiscriminate at all. It is specifically against those who are Hezbollah operatives.
A 10-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl were killed, Miri, who were not Hezbollah fighters.
My heart goes out to every innocent bystander. And what you're saying again is that there is no way to do anything against a terror entity that builds itself in the civilian population. That is exactly the blueprint that terror entities use so that you and I, decent, moral human beings, will do nothing. And when you do nothing, you get an October 7th attack. And I say it sadly. Every innocent bystander, that is horrific. But if a terrorist feels that they have a safe haven because they're inside the civilian community, what you get is the monstrous genocidal qualities of a Hamas or a Hezbollah that are being presented as if they are legitimate. Hamas and Hezbollah are not legitimate. They are terror entities, and they need to be challenged by you and by me, and not to just be limited, and I am with you on that, on the moral side, that I am never going to target a civilian, ever. And they are going to use them.
I must ask you this as well then. Is there any way back from this? Is this the moment then when, Hamas have been largely degraded, and we've seen the devastation, the 40,000 Palestinians that have died in that situation? Is there any way back now from this becoming a war that is wider, that then puts Israel up against Hezbollah and perhaps others in the region?
So I'm going to ask on this news channel. So this is Israel's problem. Hezbollah is about Israel. Hamas is about Israel.
I didn't suggest it was. I'm talking about it as a war.
In the war itself, this is now about each side looking at what the elements have. I do not know who did the attack against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it wasn't just in Lebanon, it was all over.
Miri, I'm sorry, we've run out of time, but thank you for being with Miri Eisen. There are plenty more in the next hour of the programme. Good afternoon. It is just coming up to 4 o'clock here in London, 6 o'clock in Lebanon, where there has been a second wave of attacks on Hezbollah devices. It seems today as if handheld walkie-talkies have been attacked, a number exploding, and at least 3 people are reported to have been killed in Beirut, hundreds wounded in a second day of attacks on devices. It comes almost 24 hours after those initial attacks as pages exploded. That has left at least 12 people dead, 300 people said to be in a critical condition in hospital, and thousands injured. Now, as it stands, Israel have not commented on what has been happening in the past 24 hours, but this is Beirut currently here on the left of screen, where funerals have been taking place for 4 of those killed in yesterday's incidents. Let's bring in our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, for more on this. So, Deb, look, almost exactly 24 hours on, and similar reporting now that handheld devices, this time it seems walkie-talkies exploding, 3 people having been killed.
Yes, and again, as you can imagine, experts are trying to work out and think how that could be possible in terms of yesterday when the pages started exploding, such a novel form of attack that we just haven't seen before on this scale. Obviously,
Deborah, if I can just stop you for a moment there, sorry about that. We just want to show viewers the latest footage that we have of one of these walkie-talkies that we believe may well have exploded in this latest round of attacks, incidents of handheld devices held by Hezbollah exploding. 3 people known to have been killed in the Bekaa region, hundreds injured. This reported to be one of those devices. Deb, look, sorry to interrupt you there as you were in full flow, but let's pick back up where you were taking us to, that this now the second day of this kind of incident, this kind of attack on Hezbollah.
Yeah, and again, the speculation, and obviously, like yesterday, it's speculation about how this kind of attack could be orchestrated, and obviously looking again at the supply chain for these walkie-talkies. Were they sourced at the same time as the pages that have appeared to have been tampered with? The theory is that people assume that those pages were tampered with the explosives put inside them, and then some kind of trigger and detonating device inside them, and then a trigger that could have been sent with a message that would have enabled them to explode at the same time, which is what happened yesterday. Obviously, with walkie-talkies, then they operate on a different kind of network to pages. I'm not an expert on that, but clearly, while it would be a bit harder to target walkie-talkies, as with the pages, you could have just sent messages to all of the pages and they would have then detonated. With walkie-talkies, maybe you'd need to be a bit closer to the devices to be able to get onto their networks. Could a drone have been used to trigger the explosions, if that's what's happened, if these were also mini bombs, mini ticking time bombs? You can imagine right now people will be poring over the images, looking at the damage that was caused to the devices themselves. As you're seeing on the screen, clearly there's been some kind of explosion or blast to that device, and then looking at the type of injury that it's caused, and from that trying to extrapolate what actually happened. And if you're judging by what happened yesterday, where it does seem that the pages that Hezbollah fighters were using had been tampered with explosives put inside them, then it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that perhaps the same thing has happened to these walkie-talkies. You can imagine for Hezbollah, they must be looking at all of their devices now and wondering what's safe to use in terms of attacking them from within and causing huge confusion. Clearly, this has been a very effective operation, but in terms of the indiscriminate nature of these attacks, the fact that there's been civilians and people and including children who have been nearby to the explosions when they have happened. It's that the enormity of the damage is very severe, and that will clearly feed in to the consequences. And this is an unconventional form of warfare, but make no mistake, it is still a form of warfare.
OK. Deborah Haynes, for now, thank you for that update. As we're looking at this image of a handheld radio, which we think one of the devices that's exploded in this now second day of small handheld devices used by Hezbollah in Lebanon exploding, as Deborah was saying, seemingly indiscriminately. 3 people known to have been killed in Beirut, hundreds injured in this latest round of explosions. Now, our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, is in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. She was at the funeral that was held for 4 people killed in those pager explosions yesterday, and she sent this to us in the last hour.
Yes, we're at the funeral of 4 people who were killed in the pager explosions yesterday, one of which is a young boy who's only 11, 10 years old, also along with one of the medics who was killed. The medic that was killed, he worked in a Hezbollah-controlled hospital, the son of one of the Hezbollah MPs and a Hezbollah fighter. The area is in the southern suburbs of Beirut. It's a very strong Hezbollah loyalist stronghold, if you like. But there are clearly lots of people here who are just mourning the deaths and what happened yesterday. There are hundreds and hundreds of people here, including many women. You can probably see them behind me on the steps, and children. People have come with their children and families. We heard a small, I wouldn't even describe it as an explosion, a sound of something popping, like a firework going off. We had died. There were a number of MPs who were there, Lebanese MPs there as well. We came out to try and find out what the sound was, and people were running, some of them covered in blood. There was fragments on the floor. There was blood on a car, splatters of blood on a car, and inside a car, one young man was running, and he was very, very stressed. We asked him what had happened. He said a walkie-talkie, one of the two-way radios that many of the Hezbollah security people around here are using for this afternoon's funerals, had exploded. We then saw a number of people, the Hezbollah security, gathering up all the walkie-talkies and taking the batteries out of them. Our cameraman, Sky cameraman, Jake Britton, who was trying to film all of this, was surrounded by very angry, tense Hezbollah security people who told him to stop filming. They were very angry. The situation here is obviously very tense. The funeral is still going ahead. As this was going on, as the news was unfolding in front of us, we started to get reports from around the country, further south in Lebanon, of replica small explosions. We don't know yet how many people are injured or how badly. We know here that 2 ambulances have turned out. One raced down the road that you see me standing on and appeared to pick up someone. Another one is waiting at the top. For the first time, because we've come to a number of these funerals over the past few months, there's an army presence here. And the coffins are just coming down here. There's an army presence here with a couple of personnel carriers stationed along the route. And we're hearing a lot of people are extremely tense and very, very angry about what's happening here.
Yes, and Alex, look, as we're talking and looking at these pictures of that scene, we can see people gathered there for that funeral. Just an update on those walkie-talkies that we think this time have exploded. It is reported security sources being quoted as saying that these walkie-talkies were purchased at around about the same time as those pagers were purchased. And I guess that would be fitting with what had been reported this morning and yesterday, saying that, Hezbollah had been told to stop using mobile phones and had been told to start using more analog, if we can describe them as such, devices to stop their GPS signals being tracked. But I guess if the reporting is right, that would not have stopped them being targeted in this way. No,
I mean, the problem of the Hezbollah communications network being infiltrated or being compromised was identified by the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, many, many months ago, way back at the start of the year. He gave several speeches in which he urged his supporters and anyone else to stop using phones near any sensitive areas. Even when we come to, obviously everyone's got a lot of mobile phones, but we were often told not to bring our phones into where the coffins were, where the senior Hezbollah politicians were. They were very, very sensitive. They're very sensitive all round. There's an incredible tension, very understandably in many ways, because of the large number of casualties from yesterday's pager explosion.
That's Alex Crawford reporting there from Beirut, from that funeral. The funeral, which, as you can see at the top left of your screen, is still ongoing. 4 people who were killed in yesterday's pager explosions there. Their funeral being held today in the Lebanese capital. We're also looking there at the border between Israel and Lebanon, where hundreds of thousands have had to evacuate their homes on both sides of the border after the Hamas attacks and the rocket fire, missile fire that's been exchanged near daily across that border. And on the right-hand side of the screen there, one of those handheld radios, one of the ones that we think exploded in the past hour or so. 3 people known to have been killed in Bekaa, hundreds wounded. All right, let's bring in Chris Hunter, former British Army bomb disposal expert. Chris Hunter, thanks for having the time to speak to us today. Appreciate your expertise on this sort of thing. I mean, you will have seen the reporting yesterday and now today. What do you make of what we might be seeing here with these small devices exploding?
Well, I think it's very consistent with the modus operandi that we saw yesterday. One of the reports you just had there over the air, Kamala, was that the walkie-talkies were potentially purchased at the same time. We know that the pages that were used in the explosive attacks yesterday that have been modified, they were clearly introduced into the supply network, if you like. So it makes sense that Israel would certainly, or the perpetrators of this would certainly know that if they're not using mobile phones, Hezbollah, if they're no longer going to be using pagers, walkie-talkies will be the next form of communication they would move to. And the other point is that whenever there's any sort of death in Islam, and especially amongst Hezbollah operatives, they always try and have the funeral as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. So the logical conclusion would be that they would switch to walkie-talkies for the funerals. And then again, if you were to attack those, you'd purchase them at the same time, got them, from the same introduce them to the same supply network, then you could potentially sow even more doubt and confusion and devastation and destruction amongst Hezbollah's ranks by targeting them at the funerals and so quickly after the initial attacks. So it does make perfect sense.
And sort of that doubt and confusion is what we're seeing play out at the moment. But just on the explosive in such a small device, as a bomb expert,
yes.
Chris, we're describing this as as a supply chain type attack. Is there any way of defending yourself against these sort of things? I mean, other than sweeping every single one of your devices for explosive, if that's even a thing that you could do?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible to check anything for explosive devices. You can do trace detection, you can do vapor detection. So things like dogs and vapor detection machines, things like swabs for for trace detection. Anything can detect. There are plenty of mechanisms to detect explosives. The question really is, why would you? And certainly for Hezbollah, they know that Israel has had this MO before against individuals. They've used mobile devices allegedly to target individual terrorists. We've never seen it on this scale. So the first question is, why would Hezbollah bother to check all of their communication devices for explosives? They wouldn't be expecting it. The second point is, people will be asking, well, how did they get through the airport, for example, in Beirut? How could it get through airport security when the security mechanisms there are designed to detect explosives? And the simple answer is Hezbollah runs the security at Beirut airport, so they would have, they wouldn't be checking their own equipment and items. That would just be going through freely. So I suspect that's how Israel has managed to exploit the security on this occasion.
Chris, look, when we're thinking about yesterday, and we don't know the extent of today, but certainly yesterday, sort of the thousands of people who've been injured, the huge number of devices that have been compromised in this way with explosive. And did the scale of it surprise you in any way? And when you're thinking again about the amount of explosive that's been used, what are not that you'd ever have done anything like this, but what are sort of thought processes that would go into that kind of device, would you think?
Well, I mean, I've worked on, I'm currently an EOD operator, explosive ordnance disposal operator, working against the Islamic State in Iraq. I've seen my colleagues and I have seen pretty much every type of improvised explosive device you can imagine, and certainly everything that's been in contemporary history in the last 20 years. What you don't tend to see, what I haven't seen is something on this sort of scale. But in terms of the basic explosive device, it's pretty straightforward. If you're going to carry out a mass casualty attack, you either use lots of small devices or you use several large devices. Now, obviously, if you're engaged in some sort of warfare, and in this case it's covert warfare and it's deniable operations, certainly Israel hasn't confessed to being behind this by any means. But if you wanted to apply some sort of ethical dimension to it, you wanted to minimize collateral damage, then you would look at an explosive device that was going to be in intimate contact with the body and that contained a very small amount of explosive. So that explosive blast over pressure couldn't affect anybody on the collateral in the periphery, and because it's in intimate contact, it's going to penetrate the body and cause primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary blast injuries to the body. So something like a mobile device is perfect for that, and it is possible. You'd only need a couple of ounces, 30 to 50 grams of high explosive secreted inside a device like that to be able to cause that type of explosive effect. So it doesn't surprise me at all in terms of the ingenuity and cunningness of these devices.
And Chris, I guess the sort of past 24 hours you guys have been thinking about this. Are we clear yet about the method of detonation that was used to try and explode these things? I mean, they've been described as a bit of a ticking time bomb, but of course you'd have to know exactly when it was going to go off. So would there be some kind of signal that would have been sent to them that would have then caused the detonation?
I mean, certainly, there are a number of different ways of initiating an improvised explosive device. Timed IEDs is one method. Victim-operated booby traps is another. Command-initiated, radio-controlled is another. It appears that these are most likely radio-controlled. Some sort of electromagnetic signal, RF signal that's sent through the electronic ether, transmitted to them. It could be that they're on a timer. That's very, very unlikely in this particular situation. But it's just impossible to tell at this point. You'd really have to do a proper forensic investigation. Certainly, if I could get my hands on one of the devices, I'd be able to, with my colleagues, exploit them and give you a far more detailed overview. But based on the tactics, techniques, and procedures we've seen so far, my money would be on radio control, some sort of radio signal causing these to initiate.
OK, Chris Hunter, retired British Army bomb disposal expertise there, second to none. Thank you very much for that, Chris. Really good to be able to speak with you today on this particular story. Thank you so much for that. Now, earlier I was speaking to Miri Aysen, a retired IDF colonel, and thankfully Miri's been able to join us again. Miri, thanks so much for being with us yet again. I'm sorry that our conversation got cut short previously. I just wanted to sort of take us back to where we had started our conversation about the situation that Israel finds itself in at the moment as these reported incidents are striking at Hezbollah. What's your sense of it?
So I absolutely see the difference between the strategic, I want to call it tactical capability, the description that Chris was giving before so eloquently about how you can do something like this. And so you have this enormous tactical event that happened, and what is the strategy behind it? So as an Israeli looking at it right now, for me, there are two options. One is that you are creating chaos in a terror organization that lives inside the civilian community, and you're specifically targeting the terrorists themselves, that intimate type of thing where you have your pager in your pocket, your walkie-talkie in your hand, you're in your car. It's in the terrorist's hands, and that is going to create chaos. And what can I say? I don't want a terrorist to feel safe anywhere, and I am targeting the terrorist. That has its own impact. At the strategic level, you had asked also before about, is this the beginning of a broader campaign that Israel would be doing? Tens of thousands of Israelis were evacuated from the north, from their homes on October 7th and 8th. And they can't go home. They haven't been able to go home for 11 months, not just because of rockets and missiles, because of swarms of drones. And so, yes, it could also be, I don't know this, an opening preemptive attack to create chaos on the Hezbollah terror side before something bigger. I don't know if it's to just do the chaos and to deter Hezbollah or to do the preemptive before there is a large-scale attack.
Well, Miri, the question would be whether there is a deterrence, right? Because as you will know, just a couple of days ago, the Israeli cabinet have decided that one of the war aims is making sure that those people can go back to their homes in the north of Israel. And the only way to achieve that, I mean, let's not kid ourselves that even before the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, that was not entirely secure for everyone living there. There was that threat across the border at all times. Is this, do you think, now that Israel is going to take the opportunity to try and make itself feel safer in that part of the nation?
If I was an Israeli who lives up north in a city of 24,000 people like Kiryat Shmona, I would not move back into my home when 3 kilometers from me is the Hezbollah, Radwan force, aerial drones, capabilities that there's no early warning. That is a terror military that uses it against Israel every single day. So yes, I absolutely think that there is something physical that needs to be done. And part of that are the attacks that Israel has been doing against the Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. You mentioned before the evacuation of Lebanese. Hezbollah entrenches itself. It's part of the different towns and villages. That's where they put their cache of weapons, their missiles, their drones, their operatives. That's where they're deployed in Israel. They are not the army. Hezbollah can claim from here to eternity that all that they attack are military bases, but they attack Israeli towns, villages, agricultural communities every single day. That's called a terror entity. So I do think that there will be something physical. It isn't just about the deterrence of such an attack. And again, this is assuming that the attack itself has an impact on the terror entity. This has not done anything against their enormous cache of weapons. Again, this military militia, Lebanese Hezbollah entity has hundreds of thousands of rockets, more than most standing militaries in the world. And that isn't something you can ignore when you live nearby. By the way, those rockets can reach anywhere in Israel. What Hezbollah has been doing has been targeting an area in the north of Israel, but they do have the capability to attack anywhere in Israel.
Look, Miri, what you're saying is that something must be done, and we know that is the sense among many people within Israel. What I would like to try and understand is how much safer in the near term that will make Israelis. Is there a chance that this could get worse for people within the region before there is any sense of this being settled? Some that I have spoken to about this particular situation in the Middle East and the threat of the wider war say that, well, it just has to be done because the status quo can't go on. Is that your sense of this as well, that regardless of what's going to be a huge loss of life on all sides, this has to be resolved?
So my heart is going to go out both to me as an Israeli, to 10 million Israelis, 5 million Palestinians, as we are in this horrific war. Wars are never nice. There is no pretty war. There is no good war. At the most, you can hope for a just war. And in this sense, until October 7th, I would have told you, let's try to avoid war. That would have been my response as an Israeli, and I think that that's what we were doing for many, many years. But when it comes to having a terror entity like that on the other side of your border, not just in Lebanon, Hezbollah and the Islamic regime of Iran, we keep not mentioning Iran, the Islamic regime that supplies all of the capabilities, that has all of these different proxies. As an Israeli, I sit there and go, so do I just sit here as a sitting duck and wait for the October 7th attack? And by the way, since then get blamed for my response, because An overt war against terror looks horrible. That's what's happening against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and you've already mentioned the amount of casualties. A covert war against Hezbollah, assuming that Israel did something like that, can look something like what we've seen in the last 24 hours, and yet I'm hearing, as I'm talking to you, the focus on the uninvolved, and I'm going, so what else do you do against terror? So I do think that something needs to be done. It cannot just be, letting diplomacy do its act. And I wish there was a way to deter terror entities, that they would not do an October 7th attack, that they would not feel that they get the legitimacy of the world. That's what disturbs me the most. In Hezbollah, this private Islamic regime militia that attacks Israel with drones and swarms like Russia attacks Ukraine every single day. So yes, I do think sadly that there will be a bigger war, and I wish that the world would not view this as just being about Hezbollah and Hamas against Israel. Those are terror entities that call for our destruction, and it can't be that they feel that they have safe havens.
And Miriam, look, I know you're a retired colonel from the IDF, so you perhaps come at this from a military perspective, but there is an alternative, and I might sound naive in suggesting this alternative, but is there an alternative where a full ceasefire and the return of hostages happens in Gaza, that war is brought to a close, but then there is a sense that the two-state solution comes back and that both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, are able to live in peace and dignity alongside one another? Isn't that the solution?
It's absolutely something that I would look forward to. And I think that all of us in our own ways would love to be there. And I am an Israeli that until October 6th would have said absolutely. And I say sadly, as an Israeli, that my opinion, this is about opinions, changed after October 7th. A Hamas does not live in peace with me. A Hezbollah does not live in peace with me. Go into their websites today, talk to them today. And this isn't about the last 11 months since October 7th. This is about the attack that they planned and initiated and implemented on October 7th. And I don't know how to do peace with somebody who calls for my annihilation. There are other voices. There are 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip that I would love to make peace with. But as long as they call for my annihilation, and that's what they do, then I'm not going to negotiate with somebody who at the end wants to annihilate me. And that genocidal aspect to me is a little bit too much swept under the rug in the last 11 months. It's as if presented that this is about a war and the casualties. But this war that was started by Hamas on October 7th, and Hezbollah joined in on October 7th, they're calling for our annihilation, and what they want is the legitimacy. And I am not willing for a terror entity to be the one that defines the rules of the game. That doesn't mean I can do everything as a country. We try so hard and we never target civilians. And look how many civilians have been caught up in this, and it's horrible. So yes, I'd love peace in the future. Right now, I would love to be able to live in a country where I don't feel that the world is backing the terror entities that are attacking me.
Okay, Miri Eisen, look, I'm really pleased that you were able to come back and continue speaking with me. I do thank you.
I greatly appreciate it.
All right, Miri, thank you. Thanks for being with us. All right. Look, we're continuing to bring you this rolling coverage of the situation in Lebanon as it seems as if a second wave of attacks on small handheld devices has happened. Over 100 people injured, the health ministry is saying, after handheld radios exploded today. 3 people known to have been killed in Bekaa. And just to bring you some of the wider news that has happened as we have been talking to our guests, the UN General Assembly has adopted a resolution demanding Israel end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory within 12 months. That's the General Assembly adopting a resolution. You'll know that the UN is due to hold its annual meeting in about a week or so's time, when, of course, this situation will be widely discussed. And just on the incidents and these explosions, the official news agency in Lebanon is reporting home solar energy systems exploded in several parts of the capital, Beirut, in the last hour or so. So that is on top of the handheld devices, those handheld radios that we knew have known have exploded across the country, killing at least three and wounding hundreds of others. Let's bring back in our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes. Deb, before we just talk about exactly what we understand has happened so far, I wonder if you wouldn't mind just reflecting a little bit on what we heard from the retired colonel there, Miri Aysen from the IDF, when I put it to her, that there might be another way around this to try and bring some kind of resolution to the fighting and bring the two sides back together, the two-state solution. She said, look, it's gone past that now, and this has to go to a wider war for it all to be settled, regardless of the consequence of those that will lose their lives, because that's war.
I mean, it does really feel as though we're on that path of escalation, doesn't it? And clearly, as you were saying previously, Israel did make clear at the beginning of the week that it wanted to be able to enable its people to return to their homes close to the border with Lebanon in northern Israel, from where they've had to flee in large numbers because of the increasing Hezbollah rocket attacks across the border into Israel that began following the 7th of October Hamas attacks on Israel. And the level of conflict between Israel and Hezbollah over the last almost year now has been at a scale which in normal times would have surely triggered all-out war. But clearly these are not normal times, and Israel has been singularly focused on the war in Gaza, and yet it seems as though now, with the signalling that Israel came out with at the beginning of the week about that focus towards that goal of enabling its people to return to the north, and now these unprecedented attacks against the communication devices used by Hezbollah, Israel's silence on that, its enemies and its allies have all, publicly and privately, said that they believe that Israel was behind these attacks. And the question that we were all asking yesterday was, why now? What's the plan? Is this a move by Israel because perhaps Hezbollah had got wind of the fact that their pages had been tampered with and turned into bombs, and so they needed to use them or lose them? Or is this more of an opening salvo in a very unconventional way that would then be a precursor for a wider offensive? And that has been something that officials in the UK, in the US, allies in the region have been desperately trying to prevent, to try to contain the war in Gaza and stop it from triggering a war between Hezbollah and Israel, and then potentially an all-out regional war if Iran then decided that it had to become involved. It's, as you know, very closely aligned with Hezbollah, and has made very clear that it believes that Israel is responsible for the violence that's happened in Lebanon yesterday and then again today. And so today's escalation with this new wave of blasts seemingly involving the walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah would again point to, as your guest was saying, and clearly she underlined that she doesn't know what's happening, but maybe this is a signal of a precursor for something bigger. But clearly we don't see any sign of that yet, and this is an unconventional way to wage a war. But as we know from looking at what happens in Ukraine with the way that Russia wages its war there, these hybrid tactics are blended with conventional missiles, troops, bullets, and that is just how modern warfare is fought these days. And it makes it very difficult to calculate the response. Like, how is Hezbollah going to be able to respond to what's happened to it over the past 24 hours? Clearly, it's ability to communicate now, which is a fundamental in order to be able to orchestrate any kind of coherent military response, has now been completely compromised. So you would think that they would want to wait and be able to regroup before they decide to strike back, because surely right now it's going to be very hard for them to be able to speak to each other and devise a plan.
Okay, Deborah Haynes, our Security and Defence Editor. Thanks so much for that. Of course, plenty more from Deb throughout the afternoon and evening on this unfolding story in the Middle East. Let's speak now to a former National Security Advisor for the Israeli government, Professor Chuck Frelich. He's joining us now. Professor Frelich, thanks so much for being with us today. Just first of all, let me get your reflections on what we might be witnessing here, as it would appear as if there has been a second day of handheld devices being exploded in Lebanon.
Well, Israel hasn't taken responsibility for this, so the discussion is still hypothetical. But if yesterday it looked like this was a one-off attack and it wasn't clear if it's related to some broader strategy, well, it looks like there's ongoing attacks. And this is a broader attempt to weaken Hezbollah, maybe deter it from the kind of escalation that's been going on and would seem to be leading inevitably to major hostilities, maybe even a full-out war. This could also be preparation for that. But what I think we've seen here is intelligence and operational brilliance. I don't think it gets better than this. This is really unprecedented and with remarkable achievements. Apparently, thousands of Hezbollah fighters hit here with, unfortunately, a few civilian casualties, but very, very few. It doesn't get more targeted than this. And this may be enough of a dramatic hit to Hezbollah that it will deter them from the escalation. It certainly sows deep fear. Imagine if we all walk around with cell phones today. Imagine if you were living in a situation where you didn't know if it would blow up at any point. And at a bare minimum, it's, of course, disrupted their communication systems, which they would need for a conflict now.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely terrorising, isn't it? And you say, I mean, a few civilian casualties, Professor. Some children have been killed, but of course, as you say, that this was, in your words, quite targeted. Let's just dig into the sort of deterrence factor of it. Is it your sense that potentially because of the way that this thing seems to be playing out today and yesterday, the sort of the ability of the IDF to get inside the devices of Hezbollah will show the level of capability that would then deter any kind of retaliation from Hezbollah fighters? Is that the sense that you think it could have?
Well, first, I just want to go back to your comment about the few children. And if that turns out to be the case, of course, that's a tragedy. But you're talking about family members who happen to be in the vicinity of the father at the time that this happened. Remember, the father is a Hamas terrorist, Hezbollah terrorist. And again, I don't think that there's been many cases in history of a more targeted attack than this one. I don't know if this is going to deter Hezbollah or not. Probably not. They will probably decide to respond, and maybe not immediately because their communications have been disrupted. I think they're in a state of shock at the moment, but they can bide their time. And then the question is really, do they wish to continue the ongoing escalatory spiral that we've had? For the last year, they've been firing at northern Israel and in one or two cases, the center, even Tel Aviv, incessantly, daily, numerous attacks a day. If you live in Israel's north and the northern rim has become a ghost town, something like 60,000 people are still have been forced out of their homes a year later. But people in the north are experiencing at times dozens of alert in one day. And in many cases, then there are then barrages of tens of rockets. Some hit, some are intercepted. This isn't the way to live. No country would agree to this. Okay, if Western London was firing on the eastern part of the city, nobody would agree to this. And there are Israeli border towns that literally abut the border with Hezbollah, with Lebanon. When I say literally, I mean it's meters. You could throw a rock at each other if you wanted to. And these people live, all they have to do is look out their window and they see Hezbollah. This situation must end. It's actually been going on for decades. It's not something that's recent. Unfortunately, it's not going to end anytime soon, but Israel is in a position where one way or the other, it has to change the situation so people in the north can go back to living there and they can live there just in a normal life. Diplomacy so far has failed. The U.S. has tried for the last year. It would be nice to think that a breakthrough is still possible. I think that's unfortunately a bit unrealistic.
And Professor, you'll know that in the last couple of days, the Israeli cabinet have decided that making sure that citizens can go back to that northern part of the country is now part of the war aims. So it would seem as if there is going to be measures taken to make sure that that can happen. I mean, and what that looks like, I guess, is the open question at the moment, and whether or not this is the opening salvo of that is an open question. But on the sort of the defeat of Hezbollah across the border there, it's well known, and you'll know better than me, hundreds of thousands of rockets, tens of thousands of fighters. It's a very different proposition, isn't it, than fighting Hamas in Gaza? And is that something, in your opinion, that is a necessary thing to take on at this point for Israel to feel like it's safe and secure?
You can always talk about the timing. And there are always very good reasons for saying this isn't the timing. I've been in this business for decades. I have rarely, if ever, heard somebody make the argument that this was a good timing for some sort of major military move. Mm-hmm. As I was saying before, this has been going on for decades, and there have been major rounds in the past. But at some point, a country says enough is enough. We can't tolerate this anymore. And this comes on the heels of October 7th, where it's not just idle talk. When we say that Hezbollah and Hamas, along with Iran, are planning, for them, this is a concrete plan to destroy the state of Israel, to annihilate the state of Israel. It's serious. They mean it. This isn't just some sort of rhetoric. And we saw on October 7th a pretty good attempt to do it. And had they been more successful than they were, it would have been a major step towards achieving that goal. They actually wanted to conquer all of the Negev, Israel's southern portion. They were only, thank God, they were only able to take a piece of territory, and we drove them out. Now, Hezbollah, as you're saying correctly, is a much, much bigger threat, many times Hamas. They've been building up steadily for recent decades. When Israel withdrew from Lebanon in 2000, they had approximately 6,000 rockets. During the Second Lebanon War in 2006, when the war began, they had about 12,000 rockets. And today they have maybe 150,000. So when is the right time to do this? For Israel's population, enough is enough. And you see, this isn't a case of the government getting out ahead of the people. This is the government responding to demands by, of course, the northern residents, but the broader public to put an end to this threat. Is it the right timing or not? I can give you reasons why it isn't. On the other hand, at some point, this does have to end.
Look, but Professor, we're talking here, and I do thank you for your patience in letting us take this step by step, because that's talking about the situation with Hezbollah. But is there a concern that the wider region would then be drawn into the war? I'm thinking about Iran, I'm thinking about the Houthis in Yemen as well, and what that could then do, because that is then a very multi-front, asymmetric war, isn't it?
Well, obviously there's deep concern about this. No one is avid to go and take on Hezbollah, and that's why Israel hasn't done it for years, because it is a big war, much more than Hamas. And the fact is that it's not a matter of drawing the Houthis and Iran in, they already are. And Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq. And it was yesterday or the day before, a rocket was fired from Iraq. Mm-hmm. The Houthis have repeatedly fired missiles. They've closed off the Red Sea, not just to Israeli shipping, but to the Suez Canal, to all most international shipping. And Iran, of course, is directly involved in this and behind it. And Iran launched a massive missile and drone attack on Israel on the night of April 13th, 14th. And we're probably close to doing so again in August, but it seems deterred by the United States, by the American naval presence in the region. So is there a danger of regional escalation? Yes. But if that's the case, the pressure should be put on Hezbollah and Iran and Hamas to back off. The pressure shouldn't be on Iran, on Israel, which is really, it's just, these are existential battles for Israel. And the people of Israel, the people who live in the north and in the center, I believe are correctly worried mostly about the immediate threat to their lives and less about the potential danger that the international community is worried about. But again, the pressure should be put in the right place. Iran,
Professor, look, sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to get on that point about the sort of existential sense of this. That might be something that people looking in on the situation in the Middle East don't quite understand, this feeling of existential threat that that Israel feels. Is that what is leading us down this path? And if so, then it broadening and it becoming more violent is an inevitability.
Well, I don't think anything is inevitable in life, but that does seem to be the direction that we're heading in. And again, there's still some hope maybe for a last-minute diplomatic breakthrough, but I don't think the prospects are very good. Look, you have to understand, Israel has faced enemies for decades who have called for its destruction. And they mean it. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Iranians speak almost on a daily basis of Israel's destruction. The supreme leader of Iran, Mr. Khamenei, in 2009 announced a 14-point plan in 2014, a 9-point plan for Israel's destruction, stated it explicitly. And again, they call for it in more general terms all the time. On October 7th, Hamas annihilated 1,200 people, burned some of them alive, all sorts of horrors, mass rape repeated rape of women. And Hezbollah says the same thing. As a matter of fact, they act in some concert. It's called the axis of resistance. They mean it. Now, when you live in a country which is absolutely minute, and its minute borders are long and narrow, and every inch of the country is, in essence, a border area and vulnerable, no matter where you live. I live in the Tel Aviv area. If I go up to the roof of the apartment building I live in, I can see the West Bank. I could see where the rockets could come from if there's a future peace agreement that doesn't work, okay? And people in the south can see Gaza. People up north see the Hezbollah fighters. They're right there. So the feeling is very, very real. It's not some sort of vague concept. Let's say in the Cold War, people were afraid of a nuclear exchange. It could have led, of course, to an existential result. But that was far away. This is right on the border. You see it.
Yeah.
It couldn't be closer.
Professor Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor to the Israeli government. I do appreciate your time, Professor. Thanks for being with us and for your expertise. Thank you. All right, I just want to show you some latest picture that we have coming out of the Lebanese capital, Beirut. You can see smoke coming from an apartment building. It's reported, as I told you a little earlier, that there have been several explosions of home solar energy systems. And according to sources, this is footage of the aftermath, I guess, of one of those explosions. You can see the smoke billowing from the apartment building, someone attempting to put it out with a fire extinguisher there. This coming after the news of handheld radios exploding, 3 people known to have been killed in Bekaa, hundreds injured, and obviously a day after, thousands of personal pagers exploded, killing at least 12, critically wounding 300 people, and thousands have been injured. Israel not claiming responsibility for this, but all fingers point towards this being an attack by Israel. Now, Professor Lynette Nussbacher is a former British Army intelligence officer joining us by phone. Professor, thanks very much for being with us. What's your reaction to what we're seeing again today as these small handheld devices explode?
What I'm seeing here is an Israeli shaping operation. They are shaping the information space. They are shaping the communication space. What is going on right now in Lebanon is lots of leaders in Hezbollah who thought they knew how they were going to communicate. They're taking the batteries out of their radios. They're chucking their pagers out the window, and they're looking suspiciously at all their communications equipment. And one of the things they're going to do in response is they're going to start taking out the burner phones. Now, they've all got, a bag of burner phones. They're all taking out their burner phones, and they're calling their leadership to ask for direction. And this means that the Israelis are seeing South Lebanon lighting up, and the Bekaa Valley in central Lebanon lighting up with Hezbollah senior leaders, junior leaders. They're all trying to find out what's going on. They're all trying to reestablish communications. And this means that the Israelis are going to be building up a target picture of where Hezbollah is. And it's exactly the opposite of what Hezbollah meant to do by telling everybody to stop using mobile phones because the Israelis can track them and start using pagers or walkie-talkies. So the Israelis are going to get a really clear picture of where Hezbollah is. And then they've got to capitalize on it. They've got to act. And one way the Israelis are going to act is to make it clear to Hezbollah that now is the time to change their negotiating position. But the other way the Israelis can act is take advantage of the chaos in Hezbollah and quite possibly start a kinetic attack on them.
OK, Dr. Nussbacher, we'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to let viewers know exactly what they're looking at. These are latest pictures from Beirut as those handheld radios explode across the country. It's reported now in this latest wave of handheld devices exploding, at least 9 people have been killed as a result. The second day of small handheld devices exploding across Lebanon. 12 yesterday as 12 pages, as thousands of pages exploded. And Doctor, look, as you were saying, this is, as you called it, a shaping exercise. We were speaking to a guest earlier who also said it could act as something of a deterrent, showing the capability of the Israelis. Is that something that you think is credible, that this could act as a deterrent, or, as has been promised, there must be a Hezbollah response to what's happening here?
So those are two questions. One is this deterrent? And this is not the Israelis seeking to deter. The Israelis don't want to deter Hezbollah. They want to move Hezbollah north of the Litani River, 30 kilometers north. And Hezbollah's response in negotiations has been maybe they could move 10 kilometers. But so far, Hezbollah has been able to say they're not moving an inch. They're not going to move away from the Israeli border. And the Israelis have sent a very clear signal that if Hezbollah does not negotiate seriously, then bad things can happen to them. So that's not deterrence, is it? That is an aggressive statement. It is an attack. It is an attack against Hezbollah's command and control infrastructure. And the Israelis are going to be signaling right now that if Hezbollah does not return to negotiating with a different frame of mind, then something else is going to happen that's going to take advantage of it.
Right. Dr. Nussbacher, what does that negotiation look like? Can you give us a sense of where the negotiation was previously? It's my understanding that, relations are really on the floor and have been for quite a long time. Is the hope from those in Israel that they could ask Hezbollah to move back beyond that river? Is that even possible?
Hope is the last thing to die. Listen, the Americans are trying very hard to keep negotiations alive. But one of the things that we must understand here is this is a shooting war. Just since we started to discuss this on the air, since while you were talking with one of the previous guests, Hezbollah started to rocket northern Israel. Well, that's not a change. They've been rocketing northern Israel every day for months. Mm-hmm. It's a shooting war, and the negotiations that are going on are good faith negotiations to try to end that war before it ratchets up in intensity. So one of the demands the Israelis have made is that Hezbollah abandon the fortified villages that they've built in South Lebanon since 2006. And one of the responses from Hezbollah is, of course, that they don't need to move an inch. They're well dug in. Hezbollah would really love the Israelis to come in and try to conduct large-scale kinetic operations again, because the Israelis would be smashing themselves up against a well-dug-in enemy.
So with that in mind then, Doctor, how do you begin the negotiation to try and make sure it doesn't become more kinetic? If this is the beginning of the shaping phase, does there need to be a more rocket fire, more sort of covert activity across the border to try and do that?
Well, Nasrallah has already said that he's going to come out tonight and he's going to announce a big change in the war. And he's a good speaker. He's an inspirational speaker, and he works directly to the Iranians. So whatever he says is going to have been clear with the Iranians over the course of the afternoon. And that's not opening negotiations. That is just the next step in a war that's been going on.
Dr. Lynette Msbaka, sorry to cut you short there. Really do appreciate you joining us, former British Army intelligence officer. Thank you for your expertise. We continue to look at this latest picture from Beirut as explosions again known to have occurred across Lebanon. Small handheld radios reported earlier that 3 had been killed in Bekaa, 3 have been wounded. We'll have the very latest in the next hour of the show.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm Matt Barbet. You're watching the News Hour, 60 minutes of news, analysis and interviews. We begin right now with the top stories this hour. More explosions in Lebanon. This time, handheld radios reportedly detonate, killing 9. The new wave of blasts again targets the militant group Hezbollah, which says Israel is to blame. It comes a day after handheld pagers detonated across Lebanon, killing 12 and wounding thousands. There is no response yet from Israel as concerns grow about further escalation in the conflict in the Middle East. Also this evening, a row at the heart of government erupts over reports that the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Sue Gray, is paid more than he is. And after years of strikes, train drivers accept a pay deal set to end the pain for rail travellers. Good evening, thanks for joining us. There have been fresh blasts in Lebanon in what appears to be an escalation of yesterday's deadly attacks involving exploding pagers. This time the source appears to be walkie-talkies. It's reported that handheld radios belonging to members of the militant group Hezbollah have also blown up. The militia group has blamed Israel and it has vowed revenge, but there has been no response as yet from the Israeli government. The blasts were first heard during a funeral this afternoon that was being held for the victims of yesterday's pager attacks, which killed at least 12 people and also injured thousands of others. As you can see, hundreds of people turned out for the funeral of several people who were killed in yesterday's pager attack. And this is the shot of the border between Lebanon and Israel as well. An awful lot of conjecture as to who did this and why. So let's cross to our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, who is in Lebanon right now. Alex, what is the latest from there? Because we're hearing about yet more attacks this evening as well.
Yes, we were actually at that Beirut funeral in the southern suburbs of the capital. There were 4 funerals, one of a young boy victim, he was about 10 years old, one of a medic who worked at a Hezbollah organised, controlled hospital in Beirut, another one who was the son of a Hezbollah MP and who's believed to be a fighter. He was certainly in camouflage outfit, and another fighter. And there were hundreds, literally, probably, I wouldn't be surprised if there were many thousands of people who'd gathered around this area for the 4 funerals, many of them women, a lot of children, obviously a lot of men as well. And in the middle of all of this, we were at the area where they were paying their respects. The 4 coffins were being brought out. There were a number of relatively high-profile politicians from the Lebanese government and Lebanese parliament who were in situ. And we heard this bang just outside of where the condolences were. We went outside and people were running. One man in particular who looked very ashen-faced, very stressed, hyperventilating, but appeared to be unharmed, said he was right next door to an explosion and that one of the Hezbollah two-way radios had exploded. There was a certain amount of panic amongst the Hezbollah security who were present. A lot of them we saw them using walkie-talkies and two-way radios. We saw them gathering up, a lot of them, taking out their batteries. A number of people appeared to be injured. An ambulance raced down that road. This was just as the funeral cortege was setting off, so large sections of the funeral mourners didn't actually see or hear what was going on. We were surrounded by Hezbollah supporters and Hezbollah officials at least twice who were very concerned about us filming, who were concerned about us using our phones. For the first time, and we've covered a number of Hezbollah funerals over the past few months and funerals of civilians who've been killed, for the first time we saw the Lebanese army positioned along this route. So there appeared to be, certainly by their presence, a suggestion that they were worried about security. As that was happening, we were receiving reports from around the country of almost replica blasts going off, again being linked to communication systems such as the two-way radios. Yesterday, this was within 24 hours of a whole string, multiple blasts which went off inside pages which were being used by mostly Hezbollah supporters, but they appear to have also been used by civilians or those connected to the many outfits and outlets run and organised and monitored by Hezbollah, because among the many casualties yesterday were a number of women and children. At least two of the dead, two of the funerals today were of children. We spoke to eye surgeons in Beirut earlier on today, and he talked about, well, in one of his sentences, which I remember very clearly, was, I've never seen this level of injuries before, and I never want to see them again. And he mentioned operating on a number of children and women, although he said they were predominantly male injuries. So tonight, Beirut, Lebanon, is once again in the grip of fear, and I think we understand the latest indications there are that there may be dozens of injured again from today's latest explosions. The Lebanese news agency, official news agency, even putting out that solar panels had appeared to have been involved, that fingertip security entrances to homes had blown up, that there was something perhaps in car radios. One of the cars that we passed down that funeral, I saw there was blood splattered on the outside of the car, but also inside the car, on the seats inside the car. It was very hectic and there was a lot of mayhem, because the funeral actually still carried on, and there was a lot of trying to calm people and trying to make sure that the funeral went ahead as well, Matt.
Yeah, and Alex, the attack is one thing, but whoever carried it out will want to engender that fear and confusion, it would seem, in the wider population.
I think that definitely appears to have been the case. And if that was the intention, that's certainly the result. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of shock, frankly, because yesterday, most people who saw that unfolding, these pages, multiple pages in multiple locations, pretty much countrywide, going off within a period of about half an hour, was astonishing. It was like something out of a movie, except this was real life. And talking to one of the people who are in Dahia, the southern suburb of Beirut, which is a Hezbollah stronghold, but is also a very heavily populated residential area with many people who are not Hezbollah supporters and who are not Hezbollah fighters. He described he'd been there all night and was still outside the American University Hospital in Beirut, halfway through the day, waiting for friends and relatives, along with friends and relatives outside, many of them crying or appearing to be distressed at the very least. He talked about it being, in his words, a massacre. I said, how many people did you see who were wounded? And he said, I don't know, maybe 20 just in his field of vision. At the hospitals, there were 90 hospitals all across Lebanon who were put on emergency alert and who were packed full of injured people. And even when we went to the eye hospital, which was because a lot of the injuries was as people picked up their pages, they exploded in their faces. They were still receiving people. Ambulances were still coming in, and they were being transferred from other hospitals. And the surgeon, one of the chief surgeons, had done multiple surgeries and was still doing them. So there is widespread anxiety. Definitely. According to the Minister of Health, and he visited 9 hospitals today, he said there was there wasn't a hopelessness, this is how he described it, there wasn't a sort of, he didn't feel there was a sort of helplessness even, but there was a defiance and an anger, and he thought it had brought people together in a sort of collective anger and defiance against the perpetrators of this. And of course everyone here, literally everyone, from Minister of Health to information minister, to eye surgeons, to the people at the funeral, are all pointing their finger at Israel. Although Israel, it has to be said, has neither confirmed nor denied it. Usually we do hear if they are responsible, they do tend to take credit for it, but also they've got a big, long history of not involving themselves in admitting to various atrocities like this.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me here in the studio to talk more about that is our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes. And let's just pick up on that point that Alex was making at the end there. There are a lot of fingers pointing at Israel, but whether they claim it or don't even bother responding to it is up to them. It's audacious, though, regardless.
Yeah, and it's also all part of this hybrid grey zone attack, deniable attacks, where you don't openly have, for example, a missile firing at a country, but the effect is the same in terms of seeding panic, striking damage, harm to Israel's enemy, which is what's happened, and then also underlining the sophisticated capabilities that, if it is, as everyone is speculating, Israel has when it comes to these kinds of unconventional attacks. It's interesting, so Reuters is reporting that these handheld radios that have just exploded were bought about 5 months ago, around the same time as the pagers that exploded yesterday. And we had a lot of analysis, a lot of experts who have been looking at the images of those pagers and piecing together how it could have happened. And it seems that the most likely thing is that these pages, the supply chain of the pages were infiltrated, tampered with, explosives and detonators put inside each of these pages, and then a signal could be sent to them, which is why they all exploded around the same time yesterday. With the walkie-talkies, because of the way they operate on a smaller network, it wouldn't be as easy, I don't think, and I'm not an expert on this, believe it or not, blowing up radios, to do as it would with the pages. But if that is the case, and that these two were tampered with in a similar way, with some kind of explosive put inside them and a detonator, and the ability to trigger that detonation, maybe inside the network, the short-range network that these radios operate on, that would then point to a massive infiltration of the network by presumably Israel, although Israel has not confirmed or denied this. And then another way that one security expert was saying to me that these radios could be detonated, and again, it does sound like something from a sci-fi movie, is with drones. You could use a drone to detonate them, because you would need, because of the short range of these kinds of handheld radios, could be about 15 miles, 20 kilometres, that you couldn't do it from a significant distance if you were trying to detonate them remotely. And so, again, it's all speculation, but it does point to the same sort of pattern that we saw yesterday.
We talked to Alex about the ramifications for people in Lebanon, whether they're Hezbollah supporters or not, being fearful of this. There are going to be ramifications for this beyond those borders for two reasons. The UN Security Council meets on Friday to talk about this. UN General Assembly soon to sit as well. But others are going to be looking at their devices and thinking, has our supply chain been infiltrated as well?
Yeah, well, I was sort of joking about the radio mics that we have here. I'm assuming they're safe. But yeah, no, on a serious note, absolutely, this really does bring home the fact, and I've said this a couple of times now, that when it comes to warfare, and in particular in this case, hybrid warfare, the limitations are the imagination of the attacker and the technological capabilities that they have. And with the attacks that we saw yesterday and again today, it just shows how vulnerable supply chains are, and how you can imagine countries around the world right now presumably will be looking at the newly bought maybe devices and checking whether or not they've been tampered with, checking the supply chains. There's been a lot of focus, for example, on rooting out for the UK, Chinese, Russian suppliers when it comes to big pieces of military kit. But we're not talking about big pieces of military kit here. We're talking about pagers and walkie-talkies, really basic devices that have been turned into remote bombs. And it's a reminder of the evolution of warfare. But also in this case, it just shows that the scale of the attack hasn't just been to harm the Hezbollah fighters who've been using these walkie-talkies and these pagers. But it's pretty indiscriminate in that there's been a lot of, the scale of the wounded is huge. And so the question is going to be on why this is happening. What is it? What comes next? Is this part of a natural strategy, if it was Israel that was behind it, that is about bolstering its security? And clearly, there's been radio silence from Israel on this, but the questions are going to be mounting.
Certainly are. Deborah, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's speak now to Sami Nader, who's director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs, who is also in Beirut this evening. Sami, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
What do you think's been happening then? What do you think the reason is for this?
I mean, it's clear that this is a hostile act with a very serious hostile act, because it has all the potential to throw the country into a full-blown war with Israel, one similar to the one that happened in 2006. And if any war that will be opposing Lebanon to Israel will not be confined to the Lebanese border, but it will spread all across the region and will engage proxies of Iran, like the Houthis and other organizations allied with Iran in Iraq and Syria. What happened yesterday showed how much vulnerable is Hezbollah military system, and namely at the level of the communication, and the level of the supply chain, at the level of the logistics. And lately, Hezbollah managed to cater for these weaknesses and to re-establish a balance of deterrence. But with what happened yesterday and what happened today as well, I mean, there are serious questions about what he would do next, and more importantly, if he has the capabilities and the military readiness to retaliate and to continue in this escalation path, and not to mention his readiness for a full-blown war. He has been constantly repeating that they don't want war, but they are preparing for it, they are ready for it. But today, with what happened, it shows how vulnerable is his system, and there are serious questions about his readiness. So the ball today is definitely in the camp of Hezbollah. Will he absorb what happened? Will he bet on the time factor, waiting for the new American election, hoping for a grand deal with Iran that will pave the way for a settlement? Or he will continue this tit for tat strategy and try to retaliate to save his image, and because his profile as the invincible military organization who faced up to Israel, who has been victorious in a war against Israel in 2006, took a serious blow today and yesterday.
Sami, thank you so much for the analysis. I'd like to ask you more on a personal basis, really, given that you're in Beirut, if you knew anybody who'd been hurt by this, and also what is the atmosphere like there in Beirut this evening?
Definitely, there are many civilians that have been hurt because they were walking or in the same store.
Are there people you know who've been hurt?
Yeah, not directly, but through the driver I'm working with. He has one of his relatives has been directly touched by this small detonation. But there is a sense of panic and a sense of sadness all over the country. Because what happened is a serious blow for the Lebanese, for Lebanon's sovereignty. it's not something that is only about Hezbollah and its strategy. Even those who are not supporters of Hezbollah would feel solidarity with namely the civilians who have paid the price of this confrontation.
Sami, I appreciate your time this evening. That's Sami Nader from the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs in Beirut. Thank you. You're watching the News Hour. Coming up, more from Lebanon, where hundreds of people have been wounded in a fresh wave of explosions, this time apparently targeting walkie-talkies.
When you cover big, tense protests, there's almost always a moment when the atmosphere changes. There's a different noise, and you start to smell tear gas in the air.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
When we spoke to the fishermen down in Cornwall, all the politics from Westminster was a million miles away. This was about their jobs, their livelihoods.
Trust in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello? No, yes, where is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
The most significant day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Heavy vehicle. Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
I say, bring it on.
With America divided and tensions running high, get ready for an election like no other.
Join our teams as we follow the campaign trail as America decides.
We will win.
Get closer to the action this US election with full reaction and analysis.
Sky News, the full story first.
More now on the latest explosions in Lebanon, which appear to have involved walkie-talkies blowing up, and some developing lines to bring you from Israel first. The Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, has declared the start of a new phase of the war as the army turns its attention to the northern front with Lebanon. That coming from Israel, saying there's a new phase of the war as a result of this. And just a line from Hamas, a senior Hamas official, has said the Israeli government is responsible for the repercussions of this continuous attack on Lebanon. Let's bring in Rob Clark, who's director of the Defence and Security Unit at the think tank Civitas. Rob, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Look, we've already seen not an admission that this was them, but certainly Yoav Gallant in the past few minutes saying this signals a step change in their war, and Hamas responding as you would expect. What's your take?
Well, sure. We've already seen parts of the 98th Division of the IDF forces in Gaza be redeployed to the north of Israel. This fits very much in line with the Israeli government's revamped war aims announced in the last few days about trying to try to make the north of Israel safe again for around 80 to 90,000 displaced Israeli civilians, precisely because of the onslaught of Hezbollah rockets daily since last October, something around 24 on average a day, which in itself is a war crime, but gets little attention, obviously. So we can already see this happening. We can see this as a multi-phased and multifaceted part of the Israeli operation. Israel are doing what they do incredibly well, which is keeping their cards very close to their chest, maintaining that operational security and that element of surprise. And we're seeing that unfolding right now to Hezbollah's detriment.
What do you think of that line from Yoav Gallant that says this is a new phase of the war? Is this going to involve an offensive, perhaps, into southern Lebanon?
I mean, for sure, the fact they're looking at redeploying, like I say, the entirety of the 98th Division, which has been fighting in Gaza against Hamas militants for the last year, the fact they're redeploying that division, which specialises in operating behind enemy lines, so to speak, with commando and paratrooper units, that's a very sort of full-scale, full-fat division that's capable of warfighting. So the ability to insert that into southern Lebanon to, like I've said before, create that buffer zone, which is exactly what they've done in Gaza, to try and afford the security in northern Israel. So those tens of thousands of Israeli civilians can move back into some form of security and peace in their own land, is an absolute legitimate aim for the Israeli government to do. And we can see that now. And these are the conditions being set by Israel for that to happen.
We heard from Sami Nader in Beirut that these attacks, whoever carry them out, show the weaknesses of Hezbollah. So it does prompt the question, if Israel presses ahead with what you've described, what could Hezbollah realistically do in response if they can't even communicate with each other now?
Well, sure. I mean, that's why it's been incredibly clever of Israel to sort of, blind Hezbollah at this stage. And not only Hezbollah, but its proxies in Tehran, its masters, in Tehran. The ability to actually sever those communication networks on several fronts, starting yesterday with obviously the pagers, now moving up to more, larger handheld, communications devices. Look, these devices aren't encrypted, so it's going to be incredibly easy to replicate what we've seen over the last, 24 hours across Hezbollah's, some 30,000 active militants in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah still retain an immense, conventional military threat to Israel. There's no doubt about it. They retain thousands of, missiles and deployable brigades into northern Israel if they wished. But the strengths of the Israeli Defense Forces, particularly technologically, and their immense reserves, which we've seen mobilise over the last 12 months in Gaza, would be almost a mismatch for Hezbollah. And like I said yesterday, this is absolutely not in Hezbollah's aims to either increase or to meet the threat from Israel head on. Their communications are in absolute disarray. Now is the time, if there's any time at all, for Israel to exploit that advantage. So the next few days are going to likely see this increasing.
Yeah, Rob, look, this latest series of events was prompted nearly a year ago by an audacious and barbaric attack on the 7th of October. And there's been a lot of audacious things done since then, and certainly by Israel. I mean, they haven't admitted responsibility for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, for example, and now this as well. Who's to say that Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran couldn't do something as audacious in response? What's the likelihood of that?
Well, I think the counterintelligence operation by the Israeli intelligence services, Mossad in particular, go to demonstrate, just like this operation has done, the overwhelming use of force and intelligence combined together can deliver these quite astonishing effects, really, that no other regional power in particular can muster, let alone a terrorist organisations such as Hezbollah or Hamas. They have plenty of fighters, they have plenty of conventional weapons, but the ability to circumnavigate the Israeli intelligence service, which is understandably and clearly on full alert for the last year since the 7th of October attacks, is going to be incredibly difficult for anyone to manage. And we can see that, like you say, these attacks that Israel have conducted, or likely Israel have conducted over the last few months, which have been fully legitimate military aims. That goes to demonstrate the strength of Israel militarily. And to be honest, the ability for Hezbollah now to muster any kind of adequate response conventionally is going to be incredibly diminished.
But as you said there, Hezbollah are a proxy of the IRGC in Iran. I mean, Iran does have military might. It obviously couldn't overcome Iron Dome with its missile attack a few months back, although not without the help of Israel's allies in that, including British planes too. What could Iran realistically do in response? And do you think it will respond?
I think there's a lot of pressure on Iran to respond politically. Look, there's a new regime in power. It's still a relatively new sort of regime. The head of the regime is still relatively new. He's going to be under a lot of pressure to take a stand and make quite a forceful response to this, particularly in light of the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon being injured himself yesterday.
Although he is meant to be relatively moderate in comparison to predecessors.
Absolutely, and this is where the really interesting question is going to lie. But the power in Iran has always been in the IRGC and in the military, right up to the supreme leader. So it almost circumnavigates the Iranian government directly. So there's still going to be an enormous amount of political pressure placed on the Iranian military, the regime, and the IRGC. And what's really interesting to note about this, to bring this back to the UK and why this matters to British politics in a way, obviously last year and this year in opposition, the now Labour government said that they would prescribe the IRGC as a terror organisation. So there's going to be mounting pressure now on Labour to, take a bit of a stand on this, and rather than calling for de-escalation on Israel's side, is to actually support our Israeli allies, and that includes being a lot more forceful on Iran, which is the elephant in the room.
Well, look, yes, one thing the Labour government has done is restrict some licences in terms of arms exports to Israel. What does that look like now to you?
Well, it looks the exact same as it looked 2 weeks ago when it was announced by the Foreign Office. I think it was a shameful act, dereliction of duty. And it was the exact same advice and the exact same information and intelligence that the Conservative government received, for the previous 10 months. There was no new information. So for the Labour government to act on it so decisively, so quickly, in almost a rushed manner in one of its first acts of office, once Parliament had returned after the summer recess, I think showed, quite an overwhelming bias to the fact that, the human rights side of particularly Sir Keir Starmer is going to supersede the more robust, realistic, pragmatic approach that statesmen and governments must take in issues like this.
Rob Clark, appreciate your time. It's Rob Clark, Director of the Defence and Security Unit at the think tank Civitas. Watching the News Hour. Coming up, we'll have more from Lebanon, where hundreds of people have been wounded in a fresh wave of explosions, this time apparently targeting walkie-talkies. We're expecting to hear from Washington, D.C. As you can see, things are set up there, ready for a press conference. So we'll bring you that when we get it.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
Now, there have been fresh explosions in Lebanon with at least 9 dead in attacks which appear to have targeted walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah militants. It follows yesterday's blast involving exploding pages. I'm joined now by Trevor Lawrence, who's head of the Cranfield University Ordnance Test and Evaluation Centre. It's good to see you. How do you think this happened?
The pages or the walkie-talkie bombs are we talking about specifically now?
Well, let's start with the pages.
Okay, so the amazing thing about this attack is just the scope of it and just the absolute size of the attack. Clearly, at some stage, these pages have been intercepted and a small amount of explosives along with the detonator has been inserted in there. My guess would be, rather than being modified en route, some of these pages have been obtained. They've been modified more or less, I guess, at their leisure. And then at some stage, the consignment going to Hezbollah has been substituted for another consignment of modified pages.
You've seen, I'm guessing, some of the footage of these things exploding when they're on someone, on someone's pocket or the like. How much explosive do you think would cause that kind of thing?
The thing is, when you talk about causing injuries from explosive, it's all about proximity. So the effect drops off very quickly with distance. So if you've got a device very close to somebody, you can damage them or even kill them with a very small amount of explosives. So we could be talking, and from the signs I've seen there, less than 10 grams of explosive, very, very small amount.
That's all it would take, and therefore hard to find if indeed anyone was actually looking for it in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing. It is detectable. I mean, you can swab these things and military-grade explosives can be detected, but would you even be looking for them is the question.
Well, the next question from me, Trevor, is what about the walkie-talkies, which we have heard have exploded today, and also hearing reports of other things exploding, such as parts of domestic solar panels and solar storage, potentially. We're not entirely clear on what yet, but what about those situations?
I mean, that's a lot less clear. The walkie-talkies are... although it's an audacious and clever and wide-ranging attack, it's quite clear to see how that's happened. A lot less clear with the walkie-talkies because it's hard to initiate a walkie-talkie remotely unless you know exactly the frequency that's operating on. And to mass initiate them is a lot harder than with the pages. However, some walkie-talkie systems do have an emergency button on them. So it's possible if they've been modified in a similar way, that sort of system could have been used to activate them all.
Look, I know you're an expert on ordnance and not supply chains, so I'm not going to ask you too much about that. But this is going to have others looking at their devices, isn't it? They are going to be looking back at their supply chains and seeing if there are weaknesses there.
Absolutely, it is. And as I say, I mean, everyone is looking in the direction of Israel, and they do have a history of modifying these types of devices to initiate to bombs, to target people, but never in this scope. That's the thing about this, is just the sheer breadth of the operation.
Yeah, are there any precedents for this, or is this unprecedented?
I'll say the only precedents for it have been the initiation of single devices. So there have been assassinations carried out using landline telephones and using mobile telephones, where somebody can be guaranteed to be on the other end of the phone when the device is actually activated. But nothing in this sort of mass attack. This is a game changer.
The other thing that will leap out at lots of people is that pagers and walkie-talkies feel like technology from a bygone era. I mean, there'll be plenty of younger people who've never even heard or seen a pager before. But the reason these devices are being used is because of the weaknesses of mobile phones.
Absolutely. And mobile phones, which have been used to initiate IEDs in the past on a number of occasions, weren't being used, I understand, in this situation because of the problems with identifying and tracking people through them. So without wanting to go too much in the tactics of it, which is not really my area of expertise, it's taken out another line of communication for this group, which is going to cause them massive problems.
Trevor, I really appreciate your time. It's fascinating talking to you. That's Trevor Lawrence, who's head of the Cranfield University Ordnance Test and Evaluation Centre. Let's go live now to Jerusalem. Our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, is there. And Alistair, no definitive response from Israel on this in terms of the specifics, but we have heard from Yoav Gallant saying this takes things to a new phase.
Yeah, no response from Israel, no acceptance of responsibility for what happened yesterday and today. I'm not surprised particularly by that. Israel often doesn't comment when it is behind major attacks on its enemies, which this clearly was. And to some extent, actually, it is their silence that implicates their guilt. In terms of what Yoav Gallant said, he was visiting troops in the north today. He described Israel as entering a new phase in this war. So what's he mean by that? Well, the fighting has not stopped in Gaza. Actually, 4 Israelis were killed yesterday, and airstrikes have been continuing and killing Gazans in Gaza. The fighting has not stopped there, and I think it will go on for a long time. But it has shifted in its tempo. Late last week, I was in Rafah, and the Israeli military said that they had defeated the Rafah brigade of Hamas, which was kind of the last major military objective. And so that has given the Israeli government and the IDF space to refocus, and that focus is now turning to the northern border, which has been an area of very, very active border for almost the entire duration of this war. I think it was the following day, October the 8th, that Hezbollah fired the first missiles over, and there's been missiles going backwards and forwards, Israeli airstrikes, Hezbollah missiles and drones, pretty much every single day. But the IDF have contained it whilst they've been fighting in Gaza. And now that Gaza is in a sort of a more manageable situation from an Israeli point of view, I think it's the right way to put it, they can now look to the north. And we're seeing that new phase playing out yesterday and today in the attacks in Beirut. Whether it means a ground invasion, whether it means a step up in airstrikes, we'll have to see. But it certainly means that they will be focusing there now, and the attentions will be there, and they will bolster the number of forces on that border, and they will look at different options. And that is, of course, part deterrent, part warning, but part in preparation that if they need to or decide to, they can go in on the ground.
And Alistair, as you say there, Gaza becoming potentially more manageable, do you think that's what's prompted Israel to do this now? Was there an inevitability that Israel would do something because of all those people being moved away from the Israel side of the border with Lebanon?
Yeah, so just to first sort of explain further what I mean by Gaza being more manageable. Hamas's ability to fire rockets into Israel now is not entirely eliminated, but it's, they very rarely do, Hamas, certainly very rarely they successfully fire rockets into Israel. Israeli operations, I think, will continue in Gaza for a long time. There are still hostages, as we know, there. There are still pockets of Hamas that they are fighting. But Hamas is a sort of a major military threat to Israel no longer exists. And so that gives the military space to do something else. And that something else will be, well, in part the West Bank as well, but just to focus on the north will be the north. And that has been an issue, that has been a major problem for Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu for almost a year now. He's under a lot of pressure because there's about 60 or 70,000 Israelis who are displaced from that border area. I should say there's a similar number, probably more, Lebanese displaced from the southern Lebanon border as well for the same reasons. But Netanyahu is under pressure to deal with Hezbollah, to return Israeli residents back to their homes in the north, and to create, and this is the important thing, is to create the sort of security conditions that they can live there safely. And why it's important is it's not just a case of I think even if Hezbollah were to cease fire tomorrow, and Hezbollah have always said that if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, they would cease fire in Lebanon. I think if there's a ceasefire tomorrow, that wouldn't satisfy the Israelis. The Israelis are adamant that Hezbollah need to be pushed back either voluntarily or militarily beyond what's known as the Litani River. And this is in accordance with a UN resolution, 1901, which means there should be a sort of, if you like, a zone, a buffer zone between Israel and Hezbollah forces that's anywhere between about 9 and 12 kilometres deep, depending on which part of the border you're on. It's not really worked very well in the past, because if Hezbollah have pushed back, they've then sort of come back close to the border. I was up there about 14, 15 months ago, and you're literally yards away from Hezbollah. And so Israel will not allow that situation to be repeated. And that is why even a ceasefire, I don't think, would necessarily be acceptable for Israel. A ceasefire would give potentially space for diplomacy to start, working, possibly. It's failed so far. But Israel has bigger goals than that. It has bigger goals than just a ceasefire. And it really wants to push Hezbollah back, and Hezbollah look in no mood to be pushed back.
Interesting on the UN resolution, given the Security Council is due to meet on Friday to discuss this. Alistair, thank you very much indeed. Let's speak now to Charles Lister, who's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and is in Washington, D.C. Good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Where does this leave diplomacy in the region?
Well, I think it shows that diplomacy is being pushed aside, at least for now. We saw a big push from the US. The presidential envoy, Amos Hochstein, was just in the region. I expect, knowing that the Israelis were preparing for some form of an escalation, so that was a last gasp push on the diplomatic front. But frankly, that diplomatic effort for a long time hasn't necessarily been going in encouraging directions. As your correspondent just made very clear, Hezbollah is not going to cease fire until there is a ceasefire formally in place in Gaza, and the prospects for that have been pretty grim for a long time. So Israel has taken matters into its own hands. It's facing its own domestic pressures at home to resolve the so-called Northern Front. There have been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians who have been displaced since late last year, unable to go home. Their children are out of school, and there's big domestic political pressure to get this issue with Hezbollah in Lebanon resolved. And I think we're starting to see some of that onus placed on whatever that resolution looks like. Clearly, it's a military and a security one for now.
Yeah, at the same time, Charles, hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the street demanding that Netanyahu does the right thing to bring the 100 or so hostages that may still be alive in Gaza back home. Where does this leave that situation?
Well, I expect most people are smart enough to know, and that's why so many Israelis have been out on the streets, that, Netanyahu hasn't shown a great deal of interest in making that deal. And of course, we also know that Hamas and its leader on the ground, Yahya Sinwar, has shown no real interest in making that deal either. And so those negotiations are very real, and obviously they've drawn an enormous amount of international investment, particularly from the US side and from a number of regional states. But we've constantly been butting up against this steel wall of the fact that neither side, Netanyahu or Sinwar, have shown a real willingness to entertain the kind of concessions that each of them perceive necessary to make that arrangement. And again, that's why we've started to see, the Israeli Minister of Defense said today that we, Israel, are starting to divert our resources from south to north and opening up a new front in the war. Those were his words. And so that, I think, for now at least, is the lens through which we should be viewing, the last couple of days of developments in Lebanon.
How much of a test is this for Israel's allies, the UK, the US, others, in terms of the leverage they have over Israel?
I think it's an enormous test. I mean, frankly speaking, our collective leverage, the UK, the US and others, to convince Israel to ease up at times in Gaza has frankly failed almost consistently. There is clear, but in also in a way subtle messaging coming from Washington, D.C. right now, where I am. There's pretty clear behind the scenes that the Biden administration is not happy about what has happened on Lebanese soil over the past couple of days. And the messaging has implied that, which is, We had no prior notice that this was going to happen. We have had no involvement in it, and we advise Israel to be cautious in how it acts. That's very, diplomatic niceties of way of saying, like, everyone needs to calm down right now. This is heading in a very bad direction. And that is where our respective governments are at this point in time. Everybody's worst fears have always been that a full-blown conflict could break out between Israel and Hezbollah. And frankly speaking, if we do get there, and we're not there yet, but if we did, that would blow out of the water what we have seen in Gaza in terms of destruction and casualties and violence, and significant regional spillover. And that is precisely why our governments are watching developments as closely as they are. But to your question, the leverage, frankly, is very, very minimal. We don't have a stake in terms of the domestic Israeli political calculations that are driving most of this.
And Charles, my final question is, and you would have heard me mention to Alistair there in Jerusalem, the UN Security Council meets on Friday. The UN General Assembly is due to meet as well very soon too. People are going to question the merits of both those organisations if they can't affect some sort of positive change in the region.
They are, absolutely they are. I mean, this is the challenge that we have faced with many international and regional crises. As a long-time Syria analyst, we've been in the same place where most of the international community have wanted a ceasefire and an end to the crisis and an end to the war for nearly 14 years, and we haven't got there because we've either been unwilling to use the leverage we have, or our leverage has been insufficient. And exactly the same pattern has been seen vis-a-vis the conflict in Gaza, and now the escalation of tensions between Israel and Lebanon. So it's right and it's important that all of these diplomatic efforts continue. I mean, without them, then it would be carte blanche for whoever wants to escalate. But that's not to say that diplomacy necessarily has the means, the tools and the leverage to force an end to hostilities. And ultimately, a good way of closing is to say, given the enormity of what a war like this would look like, calmer heads will hopefully prevail. And what we do know is that nobody, including Israel, wants a full-blown war. And so we're in this kind of game of very dangerous, like Russian roulette or poker, whereby we're seeing these big escalations, probably being calculated in the hope that the other side will now back off. But whether or not that will be the case, I think, remains to be seen.
Charles, I know I said it was a final question, but I'm fascinated to hear your analysis of all of this. So I would like to ask one or two more, if I may. Just the other focus is on Iran. Again, a fairly new president there seems to be some sort of a reformer by recent standards. I mean, the pressure on him now to either respond in some way, what that might be, we don't know, is going to be massive.
I mean, unquestionably, the pressure on Iran has been massive since October last year. Yes, you're right to say that a so-called reformist president has been elected, and I think that is an important development. But then at the same time, the power balance in Iran when it comes to these kinds of foreign policy, national security issues is not on the president's desk. It's with the supreme leader and directed from him through his National Security Council down to the Revolutionary Guards. And it's those centers of power that will be making the decisions. Now, within that, it's important to also remember that Iran, since October last year, has actually been, with perhaps one exception, the big aerial assault that it launched against Israel some months back. It's actually been remarkably patient and pragmatic. It has clearly not wanted to get involved in regional hostilities. And of course, the sort of calculus behind that isn't particularly surprising. It is that Iran has spent decades building a region of proxy militant actors like Hamas, like Hezbollah, to essentially do its bidding in situations like the one that we face right now. And so Iran's calculus will remain largely the same, which is Iran itself does not want to get involved. But in theory, those proxies can continue to act in a way that is in its own interests.
Charles, really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We're going to have a quick look at the weather now, and much of the country is going to stay dry until tomorrow night, when we're likely to see cloud thickening enough in the east to give some patchy rain and drizzle, while heavy thundery showers will approach from the south. This evening, it'll be largely dry and warm for much of the country, but cloud already over eastern coasts, will begin to spread inland. This is the news hour. Coming up at 6, tensions mount in the Middle East as Israel declares a new phase of the war, and there are a fresh wave of explosions in Lebanon as well.
This conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Heavy vehicle. Why only in America? People want their country to work. Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news. Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm Matt Barbette. You're watching the News Hour. 60 minutes of news, analysis and interviews. The top stories this hour. More explosions in Lebanon. This time, handheld radios reportedly detonate, killing 9. The new wave of blasts again target the militant group Hezbollah, which says Israel is to blame. It comes a day after handheld pagers detonated across Lebanon, killing 12 and wounding thousands. Tonight, Israel declares the start of a new phase of the war in the Middle East. Good evening, thanks for joining us. There's been a fresh wave of blasts in Lebanon, with Israel tonight declaring a new phase in the war in the Middle East. This time, the source of the explosions appears to be walkie-talkies. 9 people are reported to have died and dozens of others have been wounded, with claims that handheld radios belonging to members of the militant group Hezbollah have been blown up. The group is blaming Israel and has vowed revenge. Well, tonight, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said his country was opening a new phase in the war in the Middle East. He said the centre of gravity is moving north. The meaning is that we are diverting forces, resources, energy towards the north. We have not forgotten the abductees and we have not forgotten our tasks in the south. This is our duty, he continues, and we are carrying it out at the same time. Our special correspondent Alex Crawford was at the funeral for some of the victims of yesterday's blasts and heard the new explosions in Lebanon.
There were 4 funerals, one of a young boy victim, he was about 10 years old, one of a medic who worked at a Hezbollah organised, controlled hospital in Beirut, another one who was the son of a Hezbollah MP and who's believed to be a fighter. He was certainly in camouflage outfit, and another fighter. And there were hundreds, literally, probably, I wouldn't be surprised if there were many thousands of people who'd gathered around this area for the 4 funerals, many of them women, a lot of children, obviously a lot of men as well. And in the middle of all of this, we were at the area where they were paying their respects. The 4 coffins were being brought out. There were a number of relatively high-profile politicians from the Lebanese government and Lebanese parliament who were in situ. And we heard this bang just outside of where the condolences were. We went outside and people were running. One man in particular who looked very ashen-faced, very stressed, hyperventilating, but appeared to be unharmed, said that he was right next door to an explosion and that one of the Hezbollah two-way radios had exploded. There was a certain amount of panic amongst the Hezbollah security who were present. A lot of them we saw them using walkie-talkies and two-way radios. We saw them gathering up, a lot of them, taking out their batteries. A number of people appeared to be injured. An ambulance raced down that road. This was just as the funeral cortege was setting off, so large sections of the funeral mourners didn't actually see or hear what was going on. We were surrounded by Hezbollah supporters and Hezbollah officials at least twice who were very concerned about us filming, who were concerned about us using our phones. For the first time, and we've covered a number of Hezbollah funerals over the past few months and funerals of civilians who've been killed, for the first time we saw the Lebanese army positioned along this route. So there appeared to be, certainly by their presence, a suggestion that they were worried about security. As that was happening, we were receiving reports from around the country of almost replica blasts going off, again being linked to communication systems such as the two-way radios. Yesterday, this was within 24 hours of a whole string, multiple blasts which went off inside pages which were being used by mostly Hezbollah supporters, but they appear to have also been used by civilians or those connected to the many outfits and outlets run and organised and monitored by Hezbollah, because among the many casualties yesterday were a number of women and children. At least 2 of the dead, 2 of the funerals today were of children. We spoke to eye surgeons in Beirut earlier on today, and he talked about, well, in one of his sentences, which I remember very clearly, was, I've never seen this level of injuries before and I never want to see them again. And he mentioned operating on a number of children and women, although he said they were predominantly male injuries. So tonight, Beirut, Lebanon, is once again in the grip of fear, and I think we understand the latest indications there are that there may be dozens of injured again from today's latest explosions. The Lebanese news agency, official news agency, even putting out that solar panels had appeared to have been involved, that fingertip security entrances to homes had blown up, that there was something perhaps in car radios. One of the cars that we passed down that funeral, I saw there was blood splattered on the outside of the car, but also inside the car, on the seats inside the car. It was very hectic and there was a lot of mayhem because the funeral actually still carried on, and there was a lot of trying to calm people and trying to make sure that the funeral went ahead as well. And talking to one of the people who were in Dahia, the southern suburb of Beirut, which is a Hezbollah stronghold, but is also a very heavily populated residential area with many people who are not Hezbollah supporters and who are not Hezbollah fighters. He described he'd been there all night and was still outside the American University Hospital in Beirut halfway through the day, waiting for friends and relatives, along with friends and relatives outside, many of them crying or appearing to be distressed at the very least. He talked about it being, in his words, a massacre. I said, how many people did you see who were wounded? And he said, I don't know, maybe 20 just in his field of vision. At the hospitals, there were 90 hospitals all across Lebanon who were put on emergency alert and who were packed full of injured people. And even when we went to the eye hospital, which was because a lot of the injuries was as people picked up their pages, they exploded in their faces. They were still receiving people. Ambulances were still coming in, and they were being transferred from other hospitals. And the surgeon, one of the chief surgeons, had done multiple surgeries and was still doing them. So there is widespread anxiety, definitely. According to the Minister of Health, and he visited 9 hospitals today, he said there was there wasn't a hopelessness. This is how he described it. There wasn't a sort of, he didn't feel there was a sort of helplessness even, but there was a defiance and an anger, and he thought it had brought people together in a sort of collective anger and defiance against the perpetrators of this. And of course, everyone here, literally everyone, from Minister of Health to information minister to eye surgeons to the people at the funeral, are all pointing their finger at Israel. Although Israel, it has to be said, has neither confirmed nor denied it. Usually we do hear if they are responsible, they do tend to take credit for it, but also they've got a big, long history of not involving themselves in admitting to various atrocities like this.
Crawford in Beirut. We have heard this evening that Israel is opening a new phase in its war in the Middle East. Let's go live to Jerusalem, speak to our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, about that. And Alistair, no admission from Israel, no denial either, as to whether they carried out this attack on Lebanon via pagers and walkie-talkies and possibly other things as well. But certainly Yoav Gallant saying this opens up a new phase suggests that they were responsible.
Yeah, those are the words from Yoav Gallant, the Israeli Defense Minister, this afternoon, that Israel is opening up this new phase in the war. So what does he mean by that? Well, that means that the focus of Israel's military and security efforts now will be on Lebanon as opposed to Gaza. So after almost a year of fighting heavy battles in Gaza, they feel they've now reached a point in Gaza where the situation is sufficiently contained in their favour that they can now switch their attentions and divert large numbers of forces and equipment away from the Gaza front, the Gaza battlefield, and to the northern front. It doesn't necessarily mean that a land invasion is imminent. Maybe it is, we'll have to see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. What it means is that Israel's primary focus now, will be on fighting Hezbollah, to push Hezbollah back from Israel's border, and as Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's Prime Minister, said in the last few minutes, to return the residents to the north. There's around between 60 and 70,000 Israeli residents who have been evacuated for over a year from the north because of incoming missiles there. There's a lot of domestic pressure on the Israeli government to ensure that they can return, to make sure that kids can go back to school, to make sure that families can live in their homes again. I always say that, the same is happening on the other side of the border. There's a similar number of people also displaced because of massive Israeli airstrikes that have been going on there. But the Israeli government is under pressure, has been for a long time, to try and bring some resolve to the situation in Lebanon. And now it clearly feels that the conditions are such that they can focus on that.
Alistair, look, I guess there was an inevitability that Israel would do something, as you said there, because of people being evacuated from the border. But in terms of an escalation, just how significant is this?
They've always said that they would try and allow diplomacy to work, but if diplomacy failed, then they would have no other choice but to carry out military action. The diplomacy's been going on pretty intensely at times, but has never really made much progress. It's never, it's just never really sort of moved towards any sort of sense of an agreement. It's always felt like diplomacy's slightly been going through the motions when it comes to the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. And that is why I think some sort of military confrontation has always felt inevitable. Hezbollah said that they would cease fire if there was a ceasefire agreed in Gaza. There hasn't been a ceasefire agreed in Gaza, and I can't see one happening, certainly not imminently. And so the fighting's continued along the border. And what Israel has done in the last 24 hours, has stepped it up quite considerably. It stopped short of launching a sort of a conventional military invasion or major military attack on Lebanon, and instead used this tactic of exploding thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies and other devices to sow chaos amongst Hezbollah. I'm sure the Israelis would argue that it is below conventional warfare. I think Hezbollah will not agree with that, and Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, is due to give a statement tomorrow. We'll see what he has to say, but he will inevitably lay out what Hezbollah's response is going to be. I very much doubt he will be specific, but he will probably give some hint and indication what Hezbollah's response will be. And, this is, again, we get into that sort of tit for tat. Israel's carried out the attacks yesterday and today. Hezbollah will respond at some point, and so it goes on unless de-escalation methods can be found. The one thing that I think could be slightly different this time is that it might not be a sort of a one-off Israeli attack followed by a one-off Hezbollah attack. By carrying out a second wave of attacks today on walkie-talkies and other devices in Lebanon, Israel is showing that it is prepared to step it up more. I'm sure the Israelis hope that what they are doing right now is making Hezbollah think twice and perhaps pull back. I'm not sure that will actually be the result, though.
Alistair, for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now is the former Middle East Minister, Alistair Burt. Good evening to you.
Hello, Matt.
When it comes to what the Israeli government does, do you think they care about what the British government thinks?
It's not uppermost in their mind. Israel is fighting a war which now appears to be on two fronts. And quite rightly, a sovereign government is concerned about its own safety and the pursuance of the safety of its citizens. So it will be looking for contact with both the British government and the United States in particular, try and give some explanation of what it's going to do, because I should imagine the questions now are, what does Israel intend to do, having taken the action it has done now? But its first thoughts will be for its own security.
And both the US and UK governments are, of course, permanent members of the UN Security Council, which is meeting Friday, and this will be top of the agenda. What can they realistically do there?
They will be, as Alistair Bunkle has been saying, they will be urging as much de-escalation as possible from this situation. They will be warning that a threshold is likely to be reached. The difficulty of a tit-for-tat is you do not know at what stage something goes beyond the capacity of an injured party to accept. But we've been here quite recently. People thought in relation to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran there would be a huge response to that. That wasn't the case. With the killing of Hezbollah senior commanders in Beirut. There was going to be a retaliation for that. So in a way, this is a further provocation. What is Hezbollah going to do? The question for all of us is, how is this resolved? Tit for tat actually delivers nothing. Israel had a major invasion of Lebanon in 2006. Now we are where we are again. These efforts will not bring about a resolution of the situation. The only thing that will be a political solution for Gaza, for the West Bank, for East Jerusalem, as well as for Lebanon. And unless there is a political and diplomatic solution, this will go on until there's a further catastrophe.
Yeah, which will involve peace talks with all parties. Correct. Around the table. We've had peace talks recently. In retrospect, given what's happened recently, do you think they had any interest in bringing about a solution there, or they were just going through the motions?
I don't think I can tell that. We know that, again, domestic pressure in Israel is very much focused on the hostages. My contact with those in Israel says that the return of the hostages is absolutely the top priority, and a ceasefire to allow that is important. But the people of Israel also want to be secure and safe. They don't want to be threatened by Hamas. They don't want to be threatened by Hezbollah. But there seems to be a disconnect in failing to understand that the security of Israel is not based on holding Hamas or Hezbollah at bay. It's based on a political solution. The efforts of Israel to make itself secure by denying self-determination to the Palestinians and taking the action that it has over 30, 40 years has not resulted in the security of the people of Israel. Maybe it's time to try something different, but the Israelis are entitled to be secure, but so are the people of Lebanon, and so are the civilians in Gaza as well.
Yeah, and Alistair, the hostage situation remains at the crux of this. Yoav Gallant mentioned the hostages in his statement earlier, which confirmed what they're calling a new phase of the war. We've seen hundreds of thousands taken to the streets in Israel in protest at what Benjamin Netanyahu's government has failed to do in terms of the returning of the hostages. Are they going to come back? Are they going to solve that problem? Because if now they're focusing on the northern border, where does that leave the rescuing of hostages if they're still alive?
It wouldn't look to leave them in a very good place. Hezbollah has made clear that its actions at present are tied to the conflict in Gaza. They've had a long dispute with Israel for a variety of different reasons, but they've made it very clear that their actions over the last year have been in support of those in Gaza. It's difficult to see what the incentive is for those left in Hamas to return the hostages. They should, of course, do so. There's no reason why hostages should have been taken, and their treatment of them has been appalling. But the practicalities are that Hamas will only return hostages if there is a deal. If it looks likely that there is no longer going to be a deal, if Israel has turned its attention to its northern border to deal with the threats that it faces there, and quite right to try and turn those back, then it makes the prospect of a ceasefire in Gaza seem very unlikely. Unless the message is to Hezbollah, you can't win a confrontation. There must now be an end to this, because the technological superiority and the arms superiority of Israel is considerable. But that requires the diplomatic negotiation that, again, Alistair was talking about. And we don't seem to have seen the determination to end the threat of Hezbollah by negotiation, and that needs to be the next step. And I would imagine the Security Council will be focused very much on that, so that a trigger point is not reached, because tonight it looks very likely that that situation has become more acute and more dangerous.
Well, let me just finish off by asking you a question on the diplomacy and the back channels and the discussions that will inevitably be going on. It's not that long ago since the new Labour government started to restrict licences in terms of arms exports to Israel. With that in mind, what would you be saying if you were still in position as Middle East Minister, to the Foreign Secretary, to the Prime Minister, to try and effect some positive response? Because that perhaps didn't seem to work.
The restriction of arms has gone part way to send a message to Israel that it must be judged by the same standard as any other nation, and that's right. Israel's existential support must remain. Israel remains a threat of existential attack from others, and I would not expect the United Kingdom or the United States to make any changes to its arms supplies in order to prevent the sort of attack on Israel that would cause it devastation. But in return for that, there has to be a greater effort in relation to the negotiations. And I think what I would be being very positive about now is to make clear there is no answer to Gaza unless there is also an answer to what is happening on the West Bank, the future of East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza. The self-determination of the Palestinian people is now at the top of the agenda of all Israel's regional neighbours that it is seeking a normalisation process with. That will all be good news for the Middle East, but it will only happen if there is a comprehensive resolution in relation to all those other elements that have divided Israel from the Palestinians. And a further attack on Lebanon with no diplomatic resolution is only going to put us back in the situation we were in 2006. Massive devastation, but no further progress. And the people of northern Israel still feeling threatened, and the people of Palestine still feeling without self-determination, and therefore their cause will go on.
Alistair Burt, appreciate your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching the NewsHour. Coming up, hundreds of people have been wounded in a fresh wave of explosions in Lebanon today. The Israeli Defense Minister says there is now a new phase of the war in the Middle East. We'll hear from explosives experts on just how these latest attacks were carried out.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. When you think of Glastonbury, it's mud you want and music. They're going to cross to us live in a minute. Okay. Thank you so much. Brad Pitt is now a prolific producer behind the scenes.
It's not a mystery to me. We always were capable of doing this.
Oh, they're wonderful children as an audience.
Who did that?
Maverick here on the red carpet. I'm so excited, Tom Cruise. This is the story of the night.
It's the little independent film that could.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Nor have I ever struck any woman in my life.
There's this illusion of power.
Are you feeling well?
I remember covering the Oscars and that now infamous moment, the Will Smith slap. Nobody could quite believe that it had happened. You can tell from these crowds just how excited people are for the return of Pride.
These actors playing the lead roles were born long after the Sex Pistols broke up.
Are you pleased that you did say yes to the job?
I've never regretted it.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
Don't leave me!
Yeah, okay.
There's no easy goodies. There's no easy baddies.
I've had a great time here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
I say, bring it on.
With America divided and tensions running high, get ready for an election like no other.
Join our teams as we follow the campaign trail as America decides.
We will win, win, win. Get closer to the action this US election with full reaction and analysis.
Sky News, the full story first. Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. There has been a fresh wave of blasts in Lebanon this afternoon, with Israel tonight declaring a new phase in the war in the Middle East. The attacks appear to have targeted walkie-talkies this time, used by Hezbollah militants. It follows yesterday's blasts involving exploding pagers. Well, earlier on, I spoke to Trevor Lawrence, who's the head of the Cranfield University Ordnance Test and Evaluation Centre, and asked for his reaction to the explosions.
The amazing thing about this attack is just the scope of it and just the absolute size of the attack. Clearly, at some stage, these pagers have been intercepted and a small amount of explosives along with the detonator has been inserted in there. My guess would be, rather than being modified en route, some of these pages have been obtained. They've been modified more or less, I guess, at their leisure. And then at some stage, the consignment going to Hezbollah has been substituted for another consignment of modified pages.
You've seen, I'm guessing, some of the footage of these things exploding when they're on someone, on someone's pocket or the like. How much explosive do you think would cause that kind of thing?
The thing is, when you talk about causing injuries from explosive, it's all about proximity. So the effect drops off very quickly with distance. So if you've got a device very close to somebody, you can damage them or even kill them with a very small amount of explosives. So we could be talking, and from the signs that I've seen, they're less than 10 grams of explosive, very, very small amount.
That's all it would take, and therefore hard to find if indeed anyone was actually looking for it in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing. I mean, it is detectable. I mean, you can swab these things and military-grade explosives can be detected. But would you even be looking for them is the question.
Well, the next question from me, Trevor, is what about the walkie-talkies, which we have heard have exploded today, and also hearing reports of other things exploding, such as parts of domestic solar panels and solar storage potentially. We're not entirely clear on what yet, but what about those situations?
I mean, that's a lot less clear. The walkie-talkies are, although it's an audacious and clever and wide-ranging attack, it's quite clear to see how that's happened. A lot less clear with the walkie-talkies, because it's hard to initiate a walkie-talkie remotely unless you know exactly the frequency that's operating on. And to mass initiate them is a lot harder than with the pagers. However, some walkie-talkie systems do have an emergency button on them. So it's possible, if they've been modified in a similar way, that sort of system could have been used to activate them all.
Look, I know you're an expert on ordnance and not supply chains, so I'm not going to ask you too much about that. But this is going to have others looking at their devices, isn't it? They are going to be looking back at their supply chains and seeing if there are weaknesses there.
Absolutely, it is. And as I say, I mean, everyone is looking in the direction of Israel, and they do have a history of modifying these types of devices to initiate to bombs, to target people, but never in this scope. That's the thing about this, is just the sheer breadth of the operation.
Yeah, are there any precedents for this, or is this unprecedented?
I'll say the only precedents for it have been the initiation of single devices. So there have been assassinations carried out using landline telephones and using mobile telephones, where somebody can be guaranteed to be on the other end of the phone when the device is actually activated. But nothing in this sort of mass attack. This is a game changer.
The other thing that will leap out at lots of people is that pagers and walkie-talkies feel like technology from a bygone era. I mean, there'll be plenty of younger people who've never even heard or seen a pager before. But the reason these devices are being used is because of the weaknesses of mobile phones.
Absolutely. And mobile phones, which have been used to initiate IEDs in the past on a number of occasions, weren't being used, I understand, in this situation because of the problems with identifying and tracking people through them. So without wanting to go too much in the tactics of it, which is not really my area of expertise, it's taken out another line of communication for this group, which is going to cause them massive problems.
Trevor Lawrence talking to me earlier on. You're watching the News Hour. Coming up, hundreds of people have been wounded in a fresh wave of explosions in Lebanon. This is The View over the Israeli-Lebanese border this evening. And the Israeli Defense Minister has also said there is now a new phase of the war in the Middle East. We'll be live in Jerusalem next.
This conflict. They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America? People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Welcome back. There's been a fresh wave of blasts in Lebanon, with Israel tonight declaring a new phase in the war in the Middle East. This time, the source of the explosions appears to be walkie-talkies. 9 people are reported to have died and dozens of others have been wounded, with claims that handheld radios belonging to members of the militant group Hezbollah have blown up. The group is blaming Israel and is vowing revenge. Well, tonight, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said his country was opening a new phase in the war in the Middle East.
The centre of gravity is moving north. The meaning is that we are diverting forces, resources, energy towards the north. We have not forgotten about the abductees, and we have not forgotten our tasks in the south. This is our duty, and we are carrying it out at the same time. This operation is carried out by all the bodies, and the task is a clear and simple task: to return the residents of the settlements in the north to their homes safely. I think that when you look at the picture of the situation, the IDF brings excellent achievements, together with the Shin Bet, together with Mossad, on all the bodies and all the frameworks, and the results are very impressive results. We know how important it is at this time to carry out things in close cooperation. This happens first of all between all the players within the IDF, together with the other organisations, and also at the level of the most senior commanders. There is full coordination in the system and unity regarding the achievement of the goals. The Prime Minister, the Chief of Staff, the head of Shin Bet, the head of the Mossad, the Minister of Defence, everything they represent, everything in a common way is dedicated to one goal, to bring the residents back. I appreciate that we are at the beginning of a new era in this war and we need to adapt ourselves. This is true for everyone. Certainly for those who are in the air or control what is in the air, because the position here is stronger. It is not Hamas, it is something else, and we need to prepare for this matter properly, take that into account. We need consistency over time. This war requires great courage, determination and perseverance. And thank you for everything you do and carry out. We are going to complete our tasks on all fronts, and you have the duty, but also the right to be partners in this effort, each in his role, in the ground teams and the air teams.
Let's go live to Jerusalem and speak to our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle. And Ali, given what we've just heard, how significant is this?
Well, I mean, he laid out pretty clearly, I thought, there exactly what sort of Israel is doing in turning to this new phase, bolstering troops, moving equipment up to the north, putting the focus of the military objectives onto the conflict with Hezbollah, not turning away entirely from Gaza, but making the north kind of the primary objective for now. What he didn't say in that statement, or he didn't make any allusion to, was whether or not Israel was behind the attacks in Lebanon yesterday and today. But I think he went pretty close, as close really maybe as he would dare, to suggesting that it was Israel behind it. Maybe we'll never get confirmation, or certainly not in the short term, but everybody of course blames Israel for being behind it, and that is the situation we're now in. So yeah, a focus away from Gaza and to the north, and what to do there. And I think there's a number of scenarios that could play out. I think what we've witnessed this afternoon is a sort of a second wave of these explosive devices attack. It could be for a number of reasons. It could be that Israel thought that following yesterday's attacks, Hezbollah would do a real sweep of its communication devices and would probably end up discovering that in the walkie-talkies there was similar explosive material, and they decided to detonate it now. It could be that it is the second step in a much bigger plan. And, you know, we might see now more conventional Israeli military operations pushing into Lebanon, or it might be that the Israelis sort of sit back a little bit and watch what Hezbollah does, tries to monitor whether Hezbollah is in some degree of chaos, and just how badly impacted Hezbollah has been from the last 24 hours. I think if there was some sort of conventional military sort of ground movement, I wouldn't necessarily expect some sort of big invasion. I mean, we're thinking a couple of steps ahead here, but, you know, if Israel is to try and exploit maybe some weaknesses they've created in Hezbollah over the last 24 hours, then, you know, the coming hours could be quite telling. Remember back to when there was a lot of anticipation about a ground invasion in Gaza for days and days. It was inevitable. And when it actually came, it was sort of a bit by bit. It wasn't some massive movement of hundreds or thousands of troops into Gaza. It was sort of slowly, and then got to the point where it was just almost taken as a given that the ground invasion had just escalated and started. And there was a really interesting incident that didn't go unreported, but maybe didn't get much attention, about a week ago in Syria, western Syria, close to the Lebanese border. Israel carried out a number of drone strikes around a weapons factory that the Iranians have been a part of. And they blocked off the roads with these drone strikes, and then they flew in under the cover of darkness with helicopters, Israeli special forces, who dropped down and basically destroyed, or at least put this weapons factory out of action for some time, and then they retreated back over the border. So it could be, and I'm just speculating here, it could be that that is something, that kind of operation is something that we maybe should look out for from the Israelis going forward. But, you know, at the moment, the region, well, in Lebanon and Lebanese allies are reeling from what has happened, and the wider world is now urging caution because everybody understands the risks of what could happen next.
Alistair, thanks so much. Well, joining me now to talk about this is the Israeli writer and columnist Nadav Eyal. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Israel is now in a new phase of its war, according to Yoav Gallant. How do you feel about that?
Well, this was to be expected if you look at the way that this war has been developing since October 8, not October 7. On October 8, Hezbollah began its assault on Israel on the northern border. It was a decision by Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, to join Hamas in its October 7 attack. He didn't necessarily need to make that decision, but it was a factor in the solidarity of what is labeled in the Middle East the axis of resistance, and what Israel will describe as the axis of terror led by Iran. And this decision has led to an escalation after escalation in this war between Israel and Hezbollah. And indeed, Israel's aim is quite simple. It wants those dozens of thousands of refugees, displaced persons that have left their houses, that their houses are being bombed by Hezbollah since the beginning of the war, to return to the north. Hezbollah is saying that's not going to happen until you stop the war in the south. And they're not willing to climb down that tree of connecting between the southern front and their alliance with Hamas and their attack in the north.
We've heard from our correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, that the situation in Gaza now is largely manageable for the Israeli forces, for the IDF. But to bring the hostages home there, which Yoav Gallant mentioned in his explanation for this new phase, is ultimately going to require some sort of diplomatic talks, isn't it? Some discussion, some agreement with Hamas.
Absolutely. And one of the things that has been happening in the last few weeks is the way that the US has shifted its position. It was pressuring Israel. And really in the last 3 weeks, it's basically saying that Hamas has backtracked on its promises and on actually advances made in those negotiations. For instance, the number of Palestinian prisoners to be freed. The Americans thought that this deal is going to go through, and then two major things happened. The first one was Hamas murdering those 6 hostages in a tunnel near Rafah, apparently because they thought that the IDF is around and might come and rescue them. One of those hostages, an American citizen, Hersh Goldberg-Polin. And the second development was of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, deciding to backtrack on agreements already made during that negotiation. Now, what I'm saying right now, it's not the Israeli position. This is what the US is saying as to that. And of course, the Israelis are seconding this. And I need to say that in Israel, there's a lot of criticism against the prime minister for not being vigilant enough in these diplomatic efforts. But when the White House is basically saying, look, it's Hamas that has backtracked, and we're not putting any blame or responsibility with Israel right now, the deal seems to be stuck. And then Israel needs to make a decision. Does it allow its citizens in the north to keep on living in hostels and what have you while they don't have their houses, or will it change into a more combative mode with Hezbollah trying to disconnect between the fronts and making sure that Hezbollah doesn't continue on attacking in the north? Now, nobody knows if a wider war can actually bring about this kind of a result.
But Nadav, people will hear what you're saying about Israelis being evacuated from the northern border with Lebanon and moved from their homes, and they will think about the situation in the West Bank with Palestinians not being able to live in their homes and settlers, by other people's measure, illegally setting up home there instead. What can be done there to diffuse the situation? Surely settlers removing themselves from the West Bank would help?
I don't think I completely understand the argument there. Dozens of thousands of Palestinians have not been evacuated from their homes in the West Bank, as far as I know, and we can, this has not happened. There's a long-standing dispute, a conflict. There's, of course, a conflict about the settlements in the West Bank with the UK and the international community saying one thing and Israel saying another thing. But at no point did Israel start bombing cities and towns in the West Bank with rockets and missiles and displacing dozens of thousands of people since October 7 or at all. What we're seeing in the north is totally not connected, and trying to do this kind of parallel, it doesn't stand, because what happened in the north is that in October 7, Hamas invaded Israel, had its ethnic cleansing, murdered hundreds, more than 1,200 people. And then on October 8, Hezbollah attacked Israel unprovoked. There is no occupation of Israel in Lebanon. Israel has withdrawn from Lebanon in the year 2000. This was backed by the UN Security Council, as you know. And there is no territorial claim made by Hezbollah that is legitimate as far as the UK is concerned, the EU is concerned, the United States is concerned. So they have just been attacking Israel, even not because of what's happening in Gaza, Matt, because this has happened on October 8, right? So it was their decision to join the attack. And this thing in the north can basically stop, even momentarily, if Hassan Nasrallah just decides to stop shooting at Israel. Then Israel would be trapped, in a sense, and it will need to stop the war. What would it say then, right? And this is what the US is trying to bring about in its diplomatic negotiations, some sort of a standstill, a status quo that will stop the war in the north.
Nadav Eyal, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You're watching the News Hour. Coming up, hundreds have been wounded in a fresh wave of explosions in Lebanon. This is The View over the Israel-Lebanon border this evening, and this is really at the centre of all this, as well as the Israeli Defence Minister says there is now a new phase of the war in the Middle East as a result. We'll talk to Israeli diplomat Danny Ayalon next.
Coming up on the Politics Hub at 7, I will be joined by this man, Tom Tugendhat, the man vying to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Lots to talk about: Keir Starmer's expenses, events developing tonight in Lebanon, Hugh Edwards' sentencing, and of course his pitch for the leadership. All that and lots more from Westminster at 7.
Hello and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast equivalent of a Pro Plus caffeine tablet that tells you everything about what you need to know the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes.
My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico. With me in the Zoom call is Sam Coates of Sky News.
The front runner among the members, Kelly Badenoch, did much worse than I was expecting. Now, traditionally and historically, MPs want to rush to back early the front-runner candidate because it helps your chances of getting a job further down the track. It's good to be seen to be there early with the person who's going to win. And the fact that even though she was topping a lot of the surveys, that she didn't get more than 6 votes behind Robert Jenrick is very ominous for her campaign.
This issue had sort of bubbled away a bit last week. It was always going to come back this week because of the vote, but it was rather blown up again on Thursday due to a very prominent Labour Party commentator wading in on it and saying that Rachel Reeves might need an escape route. Now, that person was Ed Balls, who used possibly one of the most prominent Labour figures to speak about Treasury matters.
Oh my God.
What happened?
Sorry, I've got my cat is fighting another cat through the window. I'm going to have to stop it.
There's a cat fight.
They have breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory order, and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
I say, bring it on.
With America divided and tensions running high, get ready for an election like no other.
Join our teams as we follow the campaign trail as America decides.
We will win, win, win. Get closer to the action this US election with full reaction and analysis.
Sky News, the full story first.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
Welcome back. Let's just bring you some breaking news now. And it's come from the Lebanese Health Ministry. It says 14 people have now died and 450 others have been wounded in that second wave of explosions in communications devices in Lebanon. Witnesses say walkie-talkies used by the Hezbollah militant group exploded a day after 12 people were killed and thousands injured when pagers were detonated in Lebanon. Israel said tonight that a new phase has begun in the war in the Middle East. Joining me to talk about this is Danny Ayalon, a former Israeli diplomat and a former Deputy Prime Minister. Danny, thank you for joining us. What do you think Yoav Gallant means by a new phase in the war?
It means that the mission now that has been given to the IDF and the defense establishment in the war cabinet just 2 days ago was to bring back security and safety to our people in the north and actually secure their safe return. You know, we have a situation where 70,000 Israelis are refugees in their own homes because of the provocations and the bombardment of Hezbollah, which started this war unprovoked in solidarity, I guess, with a vicious, barbaric attack of Hamas back in October 7th. Now, once Hamas has been reduced into a years into a kind of guerrilla organization and no more as a formidable army, which it had built itself, Israel can allow itself to move forces into the north, concentrate forces in the north with the hope that Hezbollah and the Lebanese government will get the message that they should leave us alone, that they should stop the attacks and actually fulfill what they have been committed to since 2006, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, which actually prescribed the pull back of Hezbollah.
So let me come back to you, Danny, because with the Israeli government saying this is a new phase now, so soon after these exploding pagers and walkie-talkies that seemed to have killed innocent people, children included, then Israel's responsible for that.
Well, I'm not sure about that. Nobody claimed responsibility. Israel did not claim responsibility, but certainly we saw that whoever targeted those targets.
Why would it say there's a new phase in the war then if it wasn't responsible for the exploding pagers and walkie-talkies?
Yeah, the new phase in the war has been talked about before the explosions in Lebanon yesterday and today, and it has been discussed quite, I would say, extensively here in the Israeli public.
This is a coincidence, perhaps?
Well, perhaps, but you mentioned, I don't know if there were any civilian casualties. That would be unfortunate, but the question is, why would Hezbollah terrorists? Because what I understand is that the majority of all those casualties were Hezbollah terrorists. So if there were some casualties by civilians, I think, again, the fingers should be pointed at the Hezbollah terrorists, which put their device or they are embedding themselves within a civilian population.
I mean, look, whoever carried it out, it was an audacious attack, but it was indiscriminate, wasn't it?
Well, whoever carried this attack, I don't think it was indiscriminate because it was actually targeted to those devices that are carried by Hezbollah terrorists.
But with children nearby in supermarkets where innocent people are shopping.
That's not the idea, I'm sure.
Well, the idea and the execution are two different things, are they?
Yeah, if Hezbollah terrorists, they carry their device, which is used for terrorism, everywhere they go with, it's a problem. But
Danny, let me just come back with one final question, and we won't dwell on that. This new phase in the war, whether it's been talked about today or previously, what do you think it actually looks like in terms of military involvement by the IDF in northern Israel, maybe even in southern Lebanon?
Sure. So there are new formations. More divisions are moving up north with the hope that Hezbollah will get the message. And indeed, I think there is still time, which is closing and narrowing very quickly, but there is still time to actually solve the problem in the north politically or diplomatically if 1701 UN Security Council resolution is being fulfilled.
Danny Ayalon, appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Israel this evening. That is all from the News Hour for now. Thanks for watching. Coming up, it's the Politics Hub with Sophie Ridge. She'll have more on the brewing row after it emerges that Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, is paid more than he is.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.